Hey everyone, I'm AfterMOON Horrors. Before we dive into the story, I want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see listeners tuning in from different places. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. I was up before dawn, as usual, making breakfast for my kids while the storm raged outside. Charleston was buried under the kind of snow that presses against windows and bends trees until they groan. And I was already exhausted from juggling two jobs, trying to keep the bills paid and the house warm. My mornings had become a blur of cereal boxes, coffee grounds, and scrambled eggs, the kind of routine that leaves your mind raw and frayed. I noticed the frost forming first, tiny patterns on the inside of the double-paned windows, shimmering in the dim light of the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the cold seeping in, but then I saw the shape. A handprint, too high for the children to reach and far too large for anyone in the house. My stomach sank, a tight, clenching weight that reminded me of all the times I'd failed to protect them, of all the ways life had slipped past while I worked myself to the bone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the frost, maybe a smear left from cleaning the window the week before. But every morning, as I poured cereal and poured coffee, another handprint would appear, perfectly clear, steaming slightly in the cold air that seeped through the frames. I showed one to my neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, when she dropped by with a casserole. She looked at it, blinked, and then laughed nervously, patting my arm. "You've been working too hard, dear," she said. But I knew what I saw. I could feel it in my chest, that same gnawing dread I'd carried since my divorce. That fear that I wasn't enough for my kids, that I was letting them down in ways too small for anyone else to notice. At first, I tried to ignore it. I worked the night shift at the nursing home and came home to find the prints frozen on the glass, delicate but impossible to miss. I started taking photos with my phone, documenting them like some kind of evidence, but when I checked the images later, the handprints were smudged or stretched, corrupted in ways that made my stomach lurch. Even the smell changed sometimes, faint and metallic, a cold scent that reminded me of hospital wards, of antiseptic and despair. My daughter, Emma, asked if I was painting the windows as a surprise, and I laughed nervously, hiding the phone, but the look in her eyes made my heart pound. She didn't see what I saw, but she sensed something was wrong, and that alone was almost worse. The first night, I really felt the fear crawl over me. It was just after dinner. I was sitting at the kitchen table, listening to the wind howl outside, when a scrape sounded against the glass. I froze, breath shallow, and watched as a new handprint appeared, fresh and stark, spreading slowly like frost creeping along a pane. I touched it, fingers cold against the icy pattern, and felt a sting in my wrist. When I looked, a faint bruise had begun to bloom, purple and circular, as if the window itself had pressed against me. I called my mother to tell her, hoping for reassurance, but she laughed and told me I was imagining things, that I needed sleep and a day off. I hung up, alone with the bruise and the handprints, feeling the isolation tighten around me like a noose. The next day, I noticed the prints weren't just on the kitchen window. I found them on the living room and bedroom panes too, climbing higher each night, as if some invisible hand was pacing along the frames while I slept. I started covering the lower windows with blankets, but the upper ones remained. A silent gallery of shapes that made my chest pound and my hands tremble. My son, Liam, asked why I was covering the windows, and I told him it was for warmth, but I couldn't stop the fear that had lodged itself in my mind. Every shadow, every gust of wind against the panes, felt like a presence, patient and watching, testing me, reminding me that I could fail to protect my family at any moment. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I came home to find the kitchen light flickering and the prints spreading faster than ever. I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos, desperate for proof, but the images were corrupted again, smeared and warped as though something had moved between the lens and the glass. The bruise on my wrist had grown darker, the outline sharper, and I pressed my hand to my mouth, tasting the metallic tang of fear and cold. I felt eyes on me, though no one was there, and my heartbeat thudded so loud I thought it would shatter my skull. I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself I was strong enough, that I could handle this, but the prince seemed to mock me. each new one a silent accusation. I started sleeping in shifts with the kids. One eye always on the windows, blankets pulled tight around us. Some nights, I swear I saw movement behind the frost, shadows bending unnaturally, like figures paused just out of reach. I tried to talk to my boss about taking time off, but she dismissed me, saying exhaustion was normal, that I'd be fine if I just paced myself. The prince didn't care about exhaustion. They didn't care about warnings or logic. They climbed, pressing closer to the ceiling each night, and I felt my sanity fraying, thread by fragile thread. I would catch my reflection in the windows and see my eyes wide with terror, my hands shaking, and I wondered if this was how I'd always be, haunted by something I couldn't touch, something I couldn't explain, something that reminded me every day that I might fail my children. The second escalation came when I awoke to find handprints not only on the windows but smudged across the walls near them. The frost had left streaks, tiny ridges pressed into the paint. I pressed my palm against one and felt the cold bite through my skin, leaving a faint numbness that lingered. Emma woke screaming from the bedroom and ran to me, eyes wide, but when I led her to the window, the prints were gone, leaving only the faint residue of frost that quickly melted in the warmth. I tried to explain it to Marcus, the handyman I occasionally hired, showing him the walls and windows, but he laughed nervously, saying maybe the heat from the stove was causing condensation. He didn't see the bruise on my wrist or the cold sting that hadn't faded yet. The isolation, already thick, deepened into something I couldn't escape. By the third week, I barely left the house except to work. Each morning, another handprint appeared, climbing ever higher, each one perfectly distinct, impossibly large, like the ghost of someone taller than me, pressing in from the storm. I began documenting them meticulously, lining photos up in a notebook, but each night they would shift slightly, angles changing, sizes stretching unnaturally. I tried to leave a note for the kids, telling them it was nothing, but the words seemed to smudge on the page, ink running into shapes that mirrored the frost patterns. One night, a flake of frost fell from the ceiling onto my arm, cold and wet, and left a mark that tingled for days. Another reminder that what I saw wasn't just imagination. The intimate encounters became unbearable. I would hear the faintest scratches at night, like nails dragged across the glass, and sometimes the handprints would appear on the inside of the kitchen cabinets or the bathroom mirror. I pressed my fingers against one and felt a pulse, quick and unnatural, like a heartbeat beneath the frost. I screamed once, calling Marcus again, but when he arrived, he found nothing but ordinary windows, nothing to confirm my terror. Emma and Liam slept through it all, blissfully unaware. But their innocence made it worse, because I couldn't protect them from this unseen thing, couldn't shield them from my own fear. Eventually, I stopped trying to fight it. I bought thick blankets and curtains, draping every window, shutting out the storm and the frost and the impossible handprints. I still see them sometimes, in the corner of my eye when I pull back a curtain or when I wake from a dream, but I tell myself they can't reach me now. The bruise on my wrist faded slowly but never fully disappeared. A faint circle I can feel when I touch the glass behind the blankets. My notebook remains corrupted, the photos warped, an unexplainable record of what happened, proof I can't show anyone without being dismissed. I survived, yes, but I am changed. My fear lodged permanently in my chest, a shadow that follows me when the wind rises and the snow begins. If you ever find yourself noticing frost patterns on the inside of your windows, too high for anyone in the house, too large for a child, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it or wait for someone else to see. Cover the windows, keep your family close, and trust the instinct in your chest that something isn't right. The handprints will climb, slowly, patiently, and you won't hear them coming until they're pressing against the glass and you feel their cold in your bones. I learned that the hard way, and even now, years later, I still check the windows, still feel the faint metallic tang of fear, still cover them with blankets before the storm grows too loud outside. The frost waits. The storm waits. And if you leave the windows exposed, it will find you. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. It means the world to us, and you're the reason this channel keeps going. I'd been driving the same stretch of Highway 2 to 19 for over 25 years, and the snowstorms in Elkins never got easier. After a 12-hour shift at the correctional facility, the roads looked like they'd been freshly powdered by the wind, trees weighed down, the sky a dull gray that pressed on your shoulders. I'd grown used to the isolation out here. My cabin at Cutter's Ridge was 70 yards off the highway, surrounded by pines so tall they swallowed the weak moonlight. My routine was rigid. Get home, drop my uniform, make a pot of coffee, and sit by the wood stove until the storm eased. Loneliness was part of the deal, a wound I carried since my divorce, and I've never been good at carrying it gracefully. It was the quiet that got you, the kind of silence that makes the walls breathe back at you. Or so it feels when your body is bone-tired and your mind is raw from years of seeing the worst of men. That night, I pulled into the drive around 2:30 a.m., tires crunching over the snow, headlights cutting slivers of white through the dark. When I got out of the truck, I noticed the boots first. Just sitting there on the mat, facing inward. Heavy, scuffed work boots, the kind I wear. My boots. For a moment, I just stared, fingers tightening on the truck door. There was no note, no tracks leading up from the road. The snow around them was undisturbed except for the faint indent of my own footprints, leading straight past the boots and onto the porch. I shook my head, muttering, telling myself I'd been driving too long, my eyes playing tricks. Maybe I'd forgotten a pair I'd left outside, or maybe some neighbor had wandered up, drunk, and left them there. I peeked inside the cabin through the frosted glass, lights off, everything as it should be, or so I thought. Still, the feeling in my gut wasn't just cold, it was wrong, the kind of wrong that presses against your chest and makes your heart stumble. I kicked the boots lightly with my heel. No movement, no sign of anyone hiding, just there, in perfect alignment with the doorway. My hands shook slightly as I picked them up, noting the wear, the familiar smell of damp leather and sweat. They weren't mine. Not the pair I'd left in the shed 2 nights ago before the storm. I set them in the corner of the porch and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The heat of the wood stove did little to ease the frostbite feeling in my skin, and the metallic taste of fear lingered in my mouth. I tried to convince myself that this was just a prank, some trick of my tired mind, but the footprints gnawed at me. They were too precise, too deliberate, and there was a pattern to them that I recognized too well, a stride I knew. The next morning, I went out to move the boots back to the shed where I kept old work gear. The storm had quieted, leaving a brittle crust of snow over everything, and the footprints were gone, or maybe I'd imagined them disappearing overnight. Still, when I looked down at the boots, they had shifted closer to the cabin door, almost nudging it open. I swear the snow around them was packed in a way that suggested someone or something had carried them a step at a time. I called my neighbor, Joe, a retired firefighter who lived a half-mile down the ridge. He laughed when I told him what I saw, insisting I was overworked, that it was probably frost heaving the porch boards, or that I'd just left them out wrong. He didn't see it, he couldn't see it. I should have felt relief, but instead, I felt smaller, more exposed, like my own space had been violated in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I sat by the stove, sipping coffee, listening to the wind press against the roof. The boots were back on the mat, facing inward again. My hands were clammy as I traced the edges of the leather, remembering the heavy steps I had taken in these same boots all my life, steps I'd thought defined me, kept me grounded. But whoever or whatever had worn them that night, or had left them there, was mocking that definition. I wanted to throw them in the woods, bury them under snow, anything. Instead, I locked them in the shed, muttering prayers I hadn't spoken since my mother died. I didn't sleep well, the storm howling like a predator just beyond the tree line, every gust of wind sounding like boots crunching closer, crunching closer. The following days were worse. The snow kept falling, and each time I looked out the window, I saw the boots inch closer, imperceptibly, almost as if the storm itself carried them. I started leaving the shed door open a crack, just enough to watch. And every morning they were nearer. Every morning, I felt my heartbeat slow as the familiar scuff marks in the snow traced a path I didn't recognize, but that I knew too well. My reflection in the window began to look odd, like the shape of my shoulders or the line of my jaw had shifted, small but wrong, and the boots were always there, silent, waiting. One morning, I stepped outside to confront them, my old baton in hand from when I worked nights in the facility. The snow was deep up to my knees, wind biting my face. I reached the mat, and my baton slid across the boards, making a hollow sound. The boots were gone. I searched the yard, the woods beyond, and even the drive. Nothing. But when I returned inside, there were new footprints in the cabin, leading from the door to the kitchen, deep, heavy, precise. And I realized I hadn't seen them leave. I hadn't heard them leave. And in my own cabin, with the door locked, I wasn't alone. I tried recording the footprints with my phone, snapping pictures, measuring the distance between each sole. Later, the images were corrupted, nothing more than faint blurs in the snow, impossible to read, impossible to prove. I showed the photos to Joe again. He just shook his head, muttering about exhaustion and cabin fever. My own son, visiting for Christmas, asked why I looked so pale, so jumpy, and I told him it was nothing. I didn't want him to see what I was seeing, the boots that weren't mine, the footprints that weren't mine. The weight in my chest that told me I was no longer sure who I was when I wore them. The first time I touched the boots after locking them in the shed, a shallow cut appeared on my hand, small, angry, like a fingernail had scraped me from the inside out. The blood smelled like rust and snow, and I didn't remember scratching myself on anything. I washed it, but the marks stayed, pale but visible. Proof that whatever had been with me was real, tangible. The storm raged for days, the kind of wind that knocks power lines down and buries mailboxes. And every time the snow stopped, there they were again, the boots on the mat, the prints in the snow, the same stride I had always trusted, now an alien echo. I stopped going into town at night, stopped taking the long route after work, stopped trusting the safety I had always assumed came with age and experience. I kept the boots locked in the shed, but I checked them every day, every storm, and every storm they've moved closer to the house. I speak little about it, mostly to myself, muttering through coffee, wood smoke, and the constant howl of wind. There's a lesson in all of this. The world can mirror you in ways you're not prepared to recognize, and the spaces you think define your solitude can become mirrors, reflecting someone you don't want to be. Now, I keep a journal, jotting down footprints, weather, and times I leave or return. I don't fully understand why they follow me, why the boots, why the rhythm of steps that mimic mine. But I can feel it. The weight of those steps behind me, the echo of my own life growing foreign. I've seen other correctional officers weather storms. I've seen them age and crack under pressure. I didn't expect to see myself fracture in my own cabin, traced by my own tread in the snow. I can't explain it, and I doubt anyone else would understand. I don't go out at night in winter anymore. I wait for storms to pass before I even think about leaving the cabin, and if I hear boots on the mat, if I see prints in the snow, I don't confront them. I lock the door, check the shed, and whisper to myself that I am still me, but the boots keep moving, closer and closer, and I know that one day, I may wake and find them inside, beside my own bed, waiting for me to step into them. Watch the footprints. Don't follow them. That's the only warning I can offer. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. I began noticing something wrong the moment the man stepped back into the shop doorway, shaking the rain from his sleeves as if he belonged there. I remember freezing halfway through sorting a stack of returns, because I recognized the shape of the umbrella in his hand before I even saw the handle. It wasn't the one I'd lent him. Mine had a faded blue canopy with a frayed edge and a tiny ink stain near the tip from when I'd used it as a bookmark once during a rush. This one was black, perfectly intact, and closed too neatly for someone who'd supposedly walked through a storm. Even from where I stood, I could tell something was smeared across the handle. I tried to tell myself it was mud. My stomach already disagreed. He said my name as though we were old friends, even though minutes earlier he'd stood at the counter asking for directions to the taxi rank like any stranger would. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the umbrella he extended toward me, his hand hovering in that polite sort of way, like he didn't want to intrude. He wore that same soft expression he'd had earlier, the sort that makes you trust people without thinking much about it. But when I finally reached to take the umbrella, my fingertips brushed something sticky. Warm, too warm. I pulled my hand back out of instinct, and he smiled, as if he hadn't noticed anything strange. Or maybe he had noticed and enjoyed seeing me react. "You were right about the street," he said. "The taxi stand was just around the corner." His voice didn't match the words, too calm, too even, too practiced. He placed the umbrella on the counter instead of passing it to me, nodding once in a way I couldn't read, and then walked out with no hesitation at all. No hurried step. No glance back. Just walked into the rain, as if the rain were the most predictable thing in his life, and not a slicing downpour that had soaked me earlier down to my socks. I didn't want to touch the umbrella again, but I had to. It was still sitting on the counter where customers usually placed books they wanted to buy. I didn't have gloves, so I grabbed a wad of paper towels from under the till and lifted it. The weight felt wrong. My umbrella was lighter, uneven at the shaft where the metal bent slightly from an old fall. This one was perfectly balanced. A new umbrella, expensive, unfamiliar. And on the handle, the smear wasn't mud, it was darker, thicker, and already drying into the grooves. I pressed the paper towel against it and saw the brownish-red tint spread like a bruise. My name carved into the plastic was what made my knees weaken. Not painted, not written. Scratched in shallow, deliberate strokes. Emily. I remember whispering the name out loud as if saying it would somehow make it make sense. I looked through the shop's front window, but the man was already gone, swallowed by the kind of rain that turns everything blurry and quick. I told myself I was overreacting, that it might not be blood, that someone might have scratched the name earlier, that umbrellas get mixed up. But I'd kept mine since university, and I knew its every dent. This wasn't mine, and the stranger's timing wasn't accidental. Still, I tried to pretend it didn't mean anything. I wiped the handle twice more, locked the umbrella in the storage cupboard, and forced myself back to work. By closing time, the rain sounded heavier, and the street outside was nearly empty. Banbury is quiet on normal days, but a storm clears it out completely. I locked up the front door and pulled down the metal shutter halfway before remembering the umbrella in the cupboard. Part of me wanted to leave it there and forget it existed, but the thought of finding it the next morning made my chest tighten. I retrieved it carefully and carried it out with me, planning to throw it away in the big bin behind the bakery across the alley. Just as I turned the corner, a police car crawled past, its headlights catching the side of the bin. The officer inside didn't even glance my way, but something about the slow patrol made the back of my neck prickle. I waited for the car to pass completely before tossing the umbrella inside. The lid slammed louder than I expected, and the echo chased me down the alley. My flat wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk, but that night every step felt like I was being observed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though the streets were empty. No footsteps behind me, no shadows shifting in windows. Nothing. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling the stranger was somewhere nearby, watching to see where I lived. It didn't matter that logic told me he couldn't have gotten ahead of me. Logic felt small against the knot of unease growing in my chest. At home, the silence felt too deep. I checked the lock twice, then 3 times. I washed my hands even though the paper towel had done most of the cleaning earlier. That smell, metallic, faint, impossible to ignore, still clung to my mind, if not my skin. I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside jolted me awake. A passing car, a dog bark, a drip from the gutter. My dreams were fragmented images of the umbrella, the carved name, and the man's polite smile. The next morning at the shop, I went straight to the CCTV monitor. I don't know what I expected, maybe confirmation that he'd seemed harmless, or proof that I'd misremembered something. Anything that made the previous night less bizarre. I rewound to the exact moment he'd come in to ask for directions. I remembered where he stood, how he leaned slightly forward so he could hear me over the rain, how he brushed a drop from his coat sleeve. But on the footage, the counter was empty. I could see myself on the screen, talking, gesturing, even pointing toward the street, but I was talking to no one. There was no figure opposite me. No coat, no man, no umbrella, just an empty frame. I rewound again. Same result. I checked the front camera that faced the door. The door opened, the bell above it chimed, but no one entered. I felt my throat tighten. I switched between cameras, aisles, entrance, counter, back wall, but the only person visible the entire time was me. I didn't realize I'd stepped away from the monitor until my back hit the stockroom door. I could still feel the umbrella's weight in my hand even though I'd thrown it away. I thought about going back to the bakery bin to see if it was still there, but something told me not to. Deep down, I knew it would be gone and that I wouldn't handle the confirmation well. Around midday, a police alert popped up on the local news. A body had been found near the canal path, discovered early that morning by a jogger. No identity yet. The report mentioned an object found nearby that police believed belonged to the victim. The description was brief, but it stopped me cold, a broken umbrella with traces of blood. The report didn't specify color. They didn't need to. I tried to push the thought away. There had to be thousands of umbrellas discarded during a rainstorm. But my hands kept trembling whenever I tried to handle books, and customers noticed. At least 3 people asked if I was feeling unwell. I lied, saying I'd slept poorly. The truth felt too unreal to speak out loud. After my shift, I didn't want to walk home alone, but I also didn't want to bother anyone. I waited inside until the last customer left, then stepped outside to lock up. The street was wet but calmer. Puddles reflected the faint lamps, and the air smelled like damp stone. I checked both sides of the street before heading off. As I passed the bakery, my steps slowed. The bin stood exactly where I'd left it. I told myself not to look, but my feet carried me toward it anyway. I lifted the lid. The smell of stale bread and wet paper hit first. The umbrella was gone. I nearly dropped the lid. Someone had opened this bin since last night. Someone had taken the umbrella. I didn't go straight home. I walked to the police station instead, rehearsing in my head what I would say. That I'd lent my umbrella to a man. That he returned a different one stained with something suspicious. That he knew my name, that the CCTV didn't record him at all. Every version sounded absurd. When I reached the steps of the station, I froze. What if they thought I was making it up? What if my name being carved into the umbrella tied me to the scene somehow? What if the man had planned it that way? The fear wasn't just about disbelief, it was the possibility of unintended consequences. I stepped back from the station and walked home instead, feeling foolish and terrified at the same time. For the next few days, I tried to carry on normally. I avoided the news. I avoided the bakery. I avoided looking at anything reflective on the street, because I kept expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the man never returned. No mysterious umbrellas showed up at my flat. No new strange encounters, just a steady quiet that felt both relieving and suspicious, as if calm was part of the setup. Then, 3 days later, the CCTV glitch occurred. I was opening the shop early and checking the overnight footage. The cameras automatically reset around 3 a.m., and sometimes the system froze during the reboot. I wanted to confirm it hadn't happened again. I skimmed through the timeline until something caught my eye. At 2:47 a.m., the screen showed static for half a second, normal enough, but the frame right after that wasn't. It showed the counter. My counter. The umbrella lay on it, the black one, clear as day. And leaning against the counter was something else, a piece of paper. I paused the video and leaned closer. The paper had my name written in thick marker. I let the footage play. For 2 seconds, nothing moved. Then the figure of a man stepped into the frame, not walking in from an angle, not emerging from the aisle. He manifested into the image, as if he'd always been there, and the recording had simply caught up. His head turned slowly toward the camera, and though the frame was grainy, I recognized the soft expression, the practiced calm. He lifted the umbrella, tapped it twice on the counter, and set it back down. Then he placed the paper beneath it and stepped backward, fading out of the picture instead of walking away. The footage ended with static again. I stared at the monitor for so long my eyes burned. When I finally moved, I backed away from the screen until I hit a shelf. I replayed it twice more, same thing each time. There was no doubt about what I'd seen. Someone had been inside the shop during the night, someone who didn't enter through any door, someone who had access to the umbrella I'd thrown away. That was the moment I stopped trying to make logical sense of it. Something was happening that didn't fit into ordinary explanations, and pretending otherwise felt dangerous. I brought the footage to the police that afternoon. I didn't care anymore how unbelievable it sounded. They listened quietly, took my statement, and copied the recording. They promised to investigate, though I could see in their eyes they didn't know what to make of it either. 2 days later, they called me with an update. The umbrella found near the canal did belong to the victim, a man reported missing the night of the storm. His blood was confirmed on the handle. The scratches on the plastic weren't carved with any typical tool. They were made with something extremely sharp, but the exact instrument couldn't be identified. The police told me they had no suspects, no clear motive, and no explanation for why my name appeared on the handle. Then the officer asked the final question. Do you know why the victim had your old address in his pocket? I didn't. I still don't. But I moved out of Banbury within a week, and I've never used an umbrella since. I was halfway to the kitchen for a glass of water when the knocking started. Sharp and quick, like someone afraid the sound might vanish if they didn't hit the door fast enough. I froze mid-step because nobody, absolutely nobody, ever came to our house that late, and certainly not during weather like that. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall, the green digits glowing 3:11 a.m., and feeling my stomach tighten. My parents were asleep, and for a second I actually wondered whether I should wake my father first, but the knocking came again, this time weaker, almost collapsing between each tap, and something in me reacted before I could think. I hurried to the front door, unlocked it, and pulled it open just enough to peek outside. A small boy stood there, drenched from head to toe, hair stuck flat to his forehead, arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to hold his ribs together. And the moment our eyes met, he whispered, "Please, can I come inside?" His voice cracked on the last word, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. I didn't even think about danger. He looked too fragile, too cold. I opened the door wider and let him step in. Water pooled instantly beneath his feet, and his hands trembled so violently that I instinctively reached out, unsure whether he was shaking from fear or cold. I asked him his name because it felt like the right thing to do, something that might anchor him, and he answered without hesitation. "My name is Seo Jeho." The name hit me in a strange way. I couldn't place why at first, like hearing something familiar from a dream. I walked him toward the living room and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. My mother's ears were always sharper than mine. By the time I crouched down to check if the boy was all right, she was already approaching, pulling her robe tighter around her body. She stopped short when she saw him, and I swear something flashed across her face. Recognition, fear, disbelief, maybe all three. She asked his name too. And when he repeated it, I saw her glance at me in a way that didn't feel like a normal reaction. She walked into the kitchen without saying anything, but her footsteps were too fast, too purposeful. I followed her quietly and found her leaning against the counter, both hands gripping the edge as if the counter were the only thing keeping her upright. "That name," she whispered. "Where did you say he came from?" I didn't ask, should I? She cut me off with a small shake of her head. "There was a boy in my school," she said, still staring at the counter. "Same name. He went missing when I was your age. They never found him." The connection hit me so hard that I felt a chill spread through my chest. 15 years ago, the same village, the same name, and the boy in our living room looked no older than 11. I didn't want to accept the implication, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that my mother looked genuinely shaken. We went back together, and she gently asked him where he lived. The boy's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the darkness outside, and he said, "I was walking home. I lost the road." His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone who looked like he had been wandering for hours. My mother nudged me with her elbow, signaling for me to go wake my father. When he came out, he didn't speak at first. My father was the type who always assessed things before reacting. He looked the boy up and down, asked him a few questions, all simple ones. And the more the boy answered, the more the uneasiness inside me grew. His words were polite, clear, but old-fashioned, like he'd learned Korean from someone decades older. When my father asked him where his parents were, the boy lowered his head and muttered, "I don't know." Then he added, almost too softly, "I didn't mean to leave them." That sentence, something about the way he said it, pulled at me. None of this felt right, but I couldn't call the boy dangerous. He looked helpless, scared, and exhausted. My mother insisted we give him warm food, so she heated rice porridge while my father slipped into the bedroom. A moment later he returned with an old newspaper article, one I didn't even know he kept. The paper was yellowed and folded at the edges. The headline was smudged, but the photograph was unmistakable. A missing child from 1968. The boy in the photo had the same round cheeks, the same widening eyes, the same slight tilt in the eyebrows as the kid sitting on our couch. Except the boy in the article should have been well into adulthood by now. My father sat down in front of the child and placed the article on the table. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. The boy leaned forward slowly. And then something strange happened. He reached out and traced the photograph with his finger, gently, almost lovingly. "That's me," he said. My mother dropped the spoon she was holding. It clattered on the floor, sending porridge splattering. My father pressed his lips together, as if choosing between disbelief and terror. I felt torn in a way I had never felt before, caught between dread and responsibility. The kid wasn't lying. He didn't even look like he understood why his answer frightened us. I placed a hand on the blanket covering his shoulders. "Jeho, where were you before you came here?" For the first time, his expression changed. His eyes grew wide, confused, like the question triggered something inside him. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then whispered, "I walked too far." And then, I couldn't find the way back. My father asked him, "Back where?" The boy pointed toward the front door, where the water becomes mud. None of us slept after that. Even though he seemed harmless, we couldn't ignore the possibility that he needed help, real help. My father decided we would take him to the police station in the morning. The boy didn't resist. He curled up on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, and fell asleep almost instantly. And I sat across from him, watching his small chest rise and fall, trying to make sense of anything. At around 5 a.m., when the sky turned faintly gray, my father told me to get my shoes so we could take the boy to the station. But the couch was empty. The blanket lay in a crumpled heap, still damp from his clothes. We called his name. We checked the bathroom, my room, the hallway, even the closet, as if he might have been hiding. Nothing. My parents exchanged the kind of look that says more than words ever could. And my father ran outside without even grabbing his coat. I followed him. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my nose. The yard was soaked, puddles everywhere. And there, leading away from our door, were small, muddy footprints, too clear to be older than a few minutes. They headed toward the back fields, the ones we rarely walked through because the ground softened after heavy rain. We walked fast, almost running, following the trail. The mud grew deeper, our shoes sinking with every step. The footprints continued in a straight line, too straight for a child stumbling around in the dark. My heartbeat thudded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I kept expecting to see him collapse somewhere, but the trail kept going. It stopped at the edge of a rice field. Not faded, not scattered, stopped, like the boy had taken one last step and vanished into the air. My father searched the field for nearly an hour, calling his name. I stepped into the mud up to my shins, scanning the flooded rows for even a ripple. Nothing. No footprints leading away. No sign of a struggle, just the last small print pressed into the earth, perfectly shaped, surrounded by still water. When we returned home, we sat at the table in silence until the sun fully rose. My mother finally broke it by picking up the newspaper article with trembling hands. "His parents must have waited forever," she whispered. "He must have tried to come home." We reported everything. The police searched the area but found no child, no evidence of another visitor, no signs of forced entry. They took the article, took our statements, and left without giving us answers. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head. And the only thing I believe now, the only thing that aligns with everything I saw and felt, is this. The boy didn't come to our house for shelter. He came because he remembered it. And for a few hours, he finally found his way back. I caught myself stopping mid-step when I noticed the first footprint on the road, and even now I can still feel the jolt that went through me. It looked fresh, too fresh, for a path that had been hammered by non-stop rain for hours. I remember leaning closer, the water sliding off my coat, and pressing my fingers lightly to the print. Warm. Actually warm. I jerked my hand back, without meaning to, because the only person who ever walked this way barefoot was one of my students, 12-year-old Lily, and she'd been missing for 4 days. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe some local kid messing around. Maybe the warmth was from my imagination. But when I stepped back and saw the full line of prints leading up the hill and straight into the trees, that uneasy pinch in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. I wish I could say I acted logically. I didn't. I followed them. I didn't even think to call anyone, because something about those prints made me feel like she was close, like she was pulling me along. Each step looked impossibly intact, like the rain had avoided touching them. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to explain it away, maybe a neighbor telling me the guard eye had already checked this path. But no one was there. Just me, those strange footprints, and the hammering feeling that I was walking straight into something I wasn't prepared for. When the woods closed around me, the sound changed. More muted, like everything was listening. The prints continued ahead, steady, straight, never smudged, never softened by the mud. I remember whispering to myself, "Lily, please be here." Even though I knew how unlikely it was. I don't know how long I walked, but my breath kept getting louder in my ears, mostly from nerves more than the hill. The moment I reached the small clearing, the footprints simply stopped. Stopped as in, ended in the middle of a patch of mud that should have swallowed them instantly. I stood there, staring like an idiot, turning in circles to see where she could have gone, because the trees around the clearing were dense, sharp-branched, and nearly impossible to slip through. I was so focused on the ground that I didn't see her until she spoke. "Miss Allen?" Her voice came from behind me, quiet and shaky, and so unmistakably hers that my knees actually wobbled. I spun around, and there she was, standing a few feet away with her hair plastered to her face, wearing the same clothes she disappeared in. I'd seen those clothes in the missing posters every day that week. I stepped toward her instinctively, and she stepped back just as fast, her arms tight around herself. "Lily, love, it's me," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was battering my ribs. "Everyone's looking for you. We need to get you home." Her eyes kept flicking past me, like she was trying to see if someone else was nearby. Then she whispered, "Miss, I can't go home. He'll come again." I swore my whole body went cold, even though I didn't understand a word of what she meant. I kept asking who she was talking about, what happened, whether someone hurt her. She shook her head over and over, wet hair sticking to her cheeks. "He won't let me," she said, barely audible. Before I could reassure her, something about her face pulled my attention. Not an injury, nothing dramatic, but a strange stillness. Like she wasn't blinking as often as she should. Or maybe she was too calm for a child who'd been missing for days. I felt my stomach twist because something wasn't right. I tried reaching for her arm to guide her down the hill, but she flinched violently and cried out, "Don't touch me." Her reaction was so sharp it stopped me mid-motion. I kept my hands up to show her I wouldn't force anything, but inside I was struggling to understand what I was looking at. She wasn't soaked through like she should have been. Her clothes were damp, yes, but not like mine, not like someone who'd been in a storm all day. It was like she'd stepped out of a different place entirely. I kept talking softly, trying to settle her. Eventually, she said, "I didn't mean to follow him. I tried to go home, but he brought me here. I didn't want to stay." She kept glancing back toward the trees behind her, so I turned to look, expecting maybe a shadow or movement, anything that explained her fear. But there was nothing, just thick branches and wet leaves. When I turned back, she had her hands clasped tight against her stomach, and she whispered, "He doesn't like when people come looking for me." I could feel the panic rising through me, but I pushed it down and moved a step closer. "No one's here now," I told her. "I promise you're safe with me." That's when she lifted her head fully, and I noticed something I somehow missed before. Her lips were blue. Not cold blue. Oxygen-deprived blue. I stepped forward without thinking this time, and she didn't retreat. I touched her cheek as gently as I could, and her skin felt wrong. It wasn't cold or warm. It felt like touching something left sitting in water too long. My breath caught, and for the first time she didn't look away. "I'm trying," she whispered, "but he doesn't want to let me stay like this." I must have gone pale because she stepped closer, almost apologetically. "I thought you could help me." I told her we would leave together, right now, and that nothing would happen to her again. I grabbed her hand carefully to guide her out of the clearing. Her fingers curled around mine, but the grip was light and fragile. As soon as we stepped back into the trees, she stopped walking. "He knows I'm leaving." I squeezed her hand and kept moving, but she stayed rooted. When I tugged gently, her hand slipped out of mine too easily, like her skin didn't hold together the same way anymore. I froze. She looked at me with this sad, exhausted expression and said, "I wasn't supposed to see him. I wasn't supposed to follow." Before I could say anything, her body swayed slightly, like a breeze had moved through her, except I didn't feel any breeze. She whispered, "I'm really sorry." Then she stepped backward, toward the direction she'd come from. Each step she took was slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on me like she wanted me to stop her but knew I couldn't. I rushed forward, but I swear the space between us felt blocked, like an invisible current was pushing me back. My chest tightened and every part of me screamed to grab her, to drag her out if I had to. But she shook her head with a tiny motion and said, "He's calling." I don't know how to describe what happened next without sounding unhinged, but she simply folded backward into the trees. Not like someone walking away, like gravity tilted in a different direction for her alone. Her hair lifted slightly, her clothes shifted, and she was drawn in, disappearing between the branches without a sound. I ran forward and pushed through the exact spot she vanished, scraping my arms on low branches, tearing my coat, calling her name over and over. There was nothing, no sign she had ever been there. When I stumbled back into the clearing, the footprints that led me there were gone. All of them. The mud looked untouched. I don't know how long I stood there crying before I forced myself to leave. I told the police everything, every detail, every step, but the report eventually labeled my account as stress-induced misinterpretation tied to the search effort. They found no footprints, no disturbed soil, no sign she had ever been there. When they recovered her body from the river 2 days later, the doctor estimated she died shortly after the night she disappeared, well before I saw her. For months, I barely slept. I kept replaying her words, the cold blue of her lips, the way her hand felt in mine. I knew what I saw, and I knew she wasn't alive when she spoke to me. But the part that still keeps me awake isn't the impossible. It's the simple, awful truth, she whispered before she vanished from my hands, that she didn't follow something innocent. She followed someone who didn't want her found. And every time it rains and cough now, I still check the hill road, terrified that one day I'll see fresh, warm footprints again. I kept glancing at the time on my watch, trying to convince myself I wasn't already regretting flying alone to Portugal. I'd spent the whole evening wandering through unfamiliar side streets, and by the time I finally stepped out of the restaurant, the rain had turned the cobblestones into slick mirrors. I remember pulling my jacket closer and calling for a taxi because the walk back to my hotel suddenly felt longer than it had earlier. The operator told me 10 minutes. I waited under the small awning of a closed bakery, watching raindrops push each other down the glass. When I finally saw headlights turning the corner, I felt relieved enough that I didn't even check the license plate before stepping forward. The car slowed smoothly, almost elegantly, and rolled to a perfect stop right in front of me. For a moment, I felt grateful that not everything on this trip was going wrong. I opened the rear door quickly to avoid the rain, dropped into the seat, and shook the water out of my hair. I didn't think anything was strange until I leaned forward slightly and said, "Hotel Bellamar, please," only to realize no one was in the driver's seat. The car moved off the moment I spoke. It wasn't a jolt or a jump, it glided, like someone had pressed the pedal with care. My first thought wasn't supernatural or dramatic. It was confusion mixed with the assumption I was missing something obvious. Maybe the driver had stepped out for a second. Maybe he was crouched or adjusting something. It wasn't until I leaned even farther forward with my hand on the headrest and saw the steering wheel turning by itself that a cold, almost childlike fear crawled up my throat. I tried to speak again, thinking maybe there was some kind of intercom, some advanced setup I didn't understand. "Hello? Are you remote driving or something?" It sounded ridiculous, even to me. The windshield wipers sped up slightly, as if responding. I sat back slowly, pressing myself into the seat, unsure whether to get out now or stay put. We weren't going fast, but the rain made the street surfaces slick, and I didn't want to throw myself into a moving road at night in a city I barely knew. The car took a series of turns that I didn't recognize, and I pulled my phone out to check the route. No signal. Not weak, just gone. My screen showed nothing but a loading symbol. I tried the door handle next. It clicked but didn't open. Locked. The moment I touched it, the car's interior lights blinked once, as if acknowledging the attempt. I could feel my breathing getting tighter. My thoughts jumped between trying to stay rational and imagining every worst-case scenario I'd ever heard. I forced myself to speak out loud because silence made the situation feel heavier. I don't want any trouble. I just want to go back to my hotel, that's all. My voice wasn't shaking yet, but it felt close. The car didn't speed up or behave erratically. It drove with the same careful precision it had since the beginning. But every street it chose looked quieter, more isolated. I leaned toward the window and wiped the fogged glass with my sleeve to see where we were. Small houses, metal fences, a few dim porch lights, nothing familiar. I watched for pedestrians, cars, anything normal, but the rain made everything blur and stretch. I could hardly see more than a few meters ahead. Eventually, the taxi began descending a narrow road that led toward the outskirts. That's when panic hit me properly, not loud or dramatic, but a cold, rational realization that whatever was controlling the car didn't care where I wanted to go. I slid my hand down the seat, searching for something I could use, a misplaced umbrella, a bag, a tool. Nothing. The car interior was too clean, too empty. When I shifted in the seat, the backseat belt suddenly tugged slightly, as if tightening itself around me, and I froze. It didn't lock or trap me, but it adjusted like someone had just pulled it from the other side. "I want to get out," I said firmly. "Please, stop the car." To my shock, the taxi slowed immediately. It crawled to a stop beside a narrow roadside pull-off. Nothing more than gravel and a single old bus stop sign. The doors unlocked with a soft click. My instinct screamed at me to run, not look back, not question the opportunity. I shoved the door open and nearly slipped on the wet ground as I scrambled out. The moment I stepped away from the taxi, it shut the door by itself and stayed idling. I backed up a few steps, expecting it to drive off or speed toward me, but it remained still, idling softly with the headlights pointed straight ahead. I didn't have any idea where I was, and walking in the rain in an unfamiliar city at night felt almost as risky as staying inside the strange taxi. But I forced myself to pick a direction and move. My shoes were soaked within seconds, and the rain slapped my face so hard it felt like pellets. I walked for what felt like 10 minutes, until I saw a cluster of lights, maybe a convenience store or small cafe still open late. My hope surged enough that I almost sprinted. When I pushed the door open, a bell chimed, and an older man behind the counter looked up in surprise. "You are soaked, Senhor," he said in English with a heavy Portuguese accent. "You need help?" I nodded and tried to catch my breath. "I need directions, and a phone, my taxi, something was wrong with it." He frowned. "You came in a taxi? Here?" He gestured toward the window, indicating the area was the opposite direction of any taxi routes. I started explaining, but before I even got 10 words in, the bell above the store door rang sharply again. I turned, and through the glass I saw the same car parked outside, headlights on, engine humming. I felt my stomach drop so fast I nearly lost balance. The cashier leaned forward slightly, squinting. "That your taxi?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I didn't tell it where I went. To my horror, the car's passenger door opened slowly. Not all the way, just enough. Like an invitation. The cashier stepped out from behind the counter and reached under the register, probably for some kind of club or metal rod. "Stay here," he muttered as he went to the door. But the moment he touched the handle to step outside, the taxi's door slammed shut. The headlights flicked to high beams, flooding the storefront with glaring white. The man backed up quickly and locked the door. "Call police," he said. "Now." I ran to the counter and grabbed his ancient landline, dialing the emergency number he shouted to me. As the phone rang, the taxi honked once, not aggressively, but in a steady, deliberate rhythm. One long beep, pause. One long beep, pause. The cashier looked pale. "That sound," he whispered. "It's calling someone." "Calling who?" I asked, holding the phone to my ear. He pointed to the road. Another car approached slowly from the darkness, same make, same color, same taxi light. It pulled up beside the first. Then another came, and another. Within a minute, 4 identical taxis sat in a row, all facing the store, all idling in perfect unison. Their headlights didn't flicker, their wipers didn't move, No drivers inside any of them. The emergency operator answered just as the cashier whispered, "They're waiting." I tried to explain what was happening, but I could hear the operator repeating, "Sir, are you alone? Sir, are you in danger?" While I watched a fifth taxi arrive, completing a perfect semicircle around the storefront. The engines hummed at the same frequency, vibrating through the glass. "What do they want?" I whispered. "They want you," the cashier said, voice shaky. I don't know what snapped inside me, fear, desperation, maybe instinct, but I hung up the phone and shouted, "I'm not getting in. Leave me alone." All 5 taxis responded at once. Their doors unlocked simultaneously with a loud, synchronized clack. Every door opened slightly, not enough to see inside. Just enough to show they could. The cashier grabbed my arm. "Back room," he said firmly. "Now." We ran into the storage area behind the counter. He bolted the door and shut off the lights. We stood there, frozen, listening to the rain hammer the metal roof above us. For at least half an hour, the only sounds were the storm and the vibrating engines outside. Then the engines cut out one by one. A door slammed, then another, as if finally giving up. When dawn came, we stepped outside together. The road was empty, no tire marks, no sign any cars had been parked there. The police came, but all they did was take a statement that sounded unbelievable, even as I said it. There were no cameras on that street, no witnesses, no record of any taxi being dispatched to my location, but that night, when I finally returned to my hotel with the cashier's help, I glanced up at my room window before going inside. My curtains were slightly open, even though I had closed them tightly before leaving earlier. And right in front of the hotel entrance, perfectly aligned with my window, were 2 faint, wet tire tracks. Fresh, as if something had waited there all night for me to return. I was driving home from my late shift, trying to shake off the quiet exhaustion that always settles in after too many hours on my feet, when I noticed a familiar shape pulled up beside the closed servo on the corner. My husband's truck has this uneven glow on the left taillight that you can recognize even from a distance, and that was the first thing that hit me. I slowed down, thinking maybe he'd come to surprise me, or maybe something was wrong, because he never leaves the house that late. The station was dark, the forecourt empty, and yet his truck was sitting there with the engine running like he was waiting for someone. I remember feeling this strange mix of relief and confusion as I pulled over, because nothing made sense, but it also didn't feel dangerous, not yet. I got out of the car and called his name the way I normally do at home, half expecting him to pop his head out and grin at me, but the truck stayed completely still except for the steady hum of the engine. The air felt tight around me, like the silence was listening, and I walked closer, trying to catch a glimpse through the tinted side window. I could just make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, sitting absolutely straight, not shifting or reacting to me at all. I tapped lightly on the door, and when the window finally slid down, it was my husband's face looking back at me, every detail, every line, even the way his eyebrow lifts a little when he's trying to look patient. But his eyes weren't warm. They were focused on me like I was a stranger. My first instinct was that he was playing some bizarre joke, though he's never been the type. I said, "What are you doing here? Did something happen at home?" And his lips curved into a small smile, not the real one, but a practiced version of it. He said my name in a tone that was too calm, too measured, as if he was repeating a script he'd memorized imperfectly. I laughed nervously because that was easier than facing the tiny ache of fear starting in my chest. I told him I'd just finished my shift and asked why he hadn't texted me, and that smile grew even more deliberate. He gestured for me to come closer, and something inside me refused. I pulled out my phone to ring him, maybe to break whatever weird mood he was in, but the call rang inside the truck. The ringtone was his old one, the one he switched months ago. I stared at the screen, then at him, and he just watched me, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. My pulse kicked hard in my neck. Without thinking, I opened the camera and called him on video. The truck version of him didn't twitch. My real husband answered instantly, half asleep, hair flattened on one side, blinking at the sudden brightness. He mumbled, "You okay? Aren't you still at work?" I couldn't answer. I just turned the phone so he could see the man sitting in his truck. The reaction from the real him was immediate. He bolted upright and whispered, Where are you? Get away from it. Now. The man in the truck tilted his head slightly, like he could hear the voice through the glass, even though the phone volume was low. That tiny movement unraveled the last thread of logic in my mind. I stepped backwards slowly, but the copy kept watching me with this concentrated interest. The way someone looks at something they're evaluating, not appreciating. The window slid up without him touching anything, and the truck's engine shifted from idle to a faint rumble, like it was preparing to move. I didn't want to run, but every nerve in my legs was urging me to leave. I got back into my car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking badly, and I kept glancing at the petrol station as I reversed. The truck didn't pull away, it stayed angled toward me, headlights bright and unwavering. I drove home faster than I ever have, checking the mirror every few seconds, expecting to see him or it following me. But the road behind me stayed empty all the way home. When I reached the driveway, my husband ran out barefoot, still in his pajamas, and grabbed me the moment I stepped out. He was trembling, and I realized I was too, both of us standing there grasping onto each other like people who'd nearly drowned. We locked the doors, turned on every light, and sat in the kitchen trying to make sense of what I'd seen. He swore he hadn't left the house. He even showed me the timestamps on his phone, the half-played video he'd fallen asleep to, the message draft he hadn't finished typing to me earlier. Everything supported what I already knew. The man at the petrol station wasn't him. He asked me to describe the copy again, and I tried, but the more I explained, the more disoriented I felt. It wasn't just that the man looked like him. It was that he acted like someone studying him, mimicking only the external pieces, missing the things that make a person feel real. We barely slept that night. Every car that passed outside made both of us freeze. At around 4 a.m, a notification buzzed on my phone. It was a photo message with no sender name, just a number I didn't recognize. The picture was of me standing beside the truck earlier, taken from the passenger seat, but the most chilling part was the timestamp 5 minutes before I left the hospital. Someone had been inside that truck long before I got there. My husband grabbed the phone from me and made me sit down because he said I looked like I was going to faint. He wasn't wrong. The edges of the room felt too sharp, too bright. We contacted the police after sunrise, but the more we explained, the less believable we sounded. They checked the petrol station cameras, but the angle facing the truck was fogged over, like condensation had gathered unnaturally on just that one lens. They did verify something, though his truck had never left our driveway. The one I saw had the same dents, the same faint scratch on the rear bumper, even the same sticker on the back window, but it wasn't his. They kept asking if someone might have duplicated the vehicle or if we had enemies. The questions felt small compared to what we had faced. I kept thinking about the way the copy looked at me, not aggressive, not affectionate, more like he was assessing how well I fit into some plan I wasn't aware of. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the paranoia that someone might be watching us, trying to slip into our lives by replacing the familiar with the nearly identical. My husband kept checking the driveway every night before bed, just to reassure me, though he never said it was only for me. There were moments he'd look out the window with this far-off expression, like part of him feared he might someday see himself standing outside, mirroring him. We started leaving notes for each other in odd places, a habit neither of us had before, little assurances that we were still ourselves. It sounds foolish now, but at that time we were desperate for anything that anchored us to normality. The closure didn't come from answers, because we never got any. It came from the night we finally drove past that same petrol station together, weeks later. His real truck was the only one on the road, and when we parked across the street, everything looked painfully ordinary. No strange vehicles, no figures waiting, no hidden eyes observing. It struck me then that whatever had taken his face hadn't followed us home, hadn't attempted to reappear, hadn't tried to insert itself into our lives again. Maybe it couldn't. Maybe it only needed one moment that night to test something, learn something, decide something. Whatever purpose it had, we weren't part of it anymore. We left that place with an understanding neither of us had spoken aloud. Sometimes the most frightening things aren't the ones that try to harm you. They're the ones that imitate you just well enough to step into your life, assess its shape, and then leave before you ever understand what they wanted. I'm going to tell this as carefully as I can, because every time I think about that night, I still feel the same tightness in my chest that I felt when I was trapped inside that booth. I wasn't doing anything unusual, just walking home after study group, annoyed at myself for forgetting my jacket. The rain started so suddenly, it felt like someone dumped a bucket over the whole street. By the time I reached the phone booth near the bakery, my hair was plastered to my face, and my school bag was already dripping through the seams. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and felt a brief wave of relief. The booth wasn't warm, but it was at least dry. I shook my hands, wiped my forehead, and tried to catch my breath, telling myself I'd wait a minute before running the last stretch home. I remember pressing my forehead to the glass, watching the puddles form outside, listening to the rhythmic tapping on the roof. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my breathing settle. Then something felt off. At first, I assumed rain was blowing in from the crack near the door, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't dripping, it was trickling, steady and deliberate. When I looked down, I froze. A thin layer of water was spreading across the floor, not from the sides, but from the center, seeping upward as if someone placed a hidden hose beneath the metal plate. I bent down to touch it, and it wasn't just wet, it was warm, like it came from inside a pipe rather than the storm. I reached for the door immediately, instinctively wanting to get out, but the handle didn't budge. I tried again, twisting harder, pushing my shoulder against the glass. Nothing. The door rattled in its frame but stayed locked, even though it had no lock inside. I told myself the wood had swollen from humidity or the latch got jammed. I kept trying, refusing to panic, but every attempt just made my palms sweat more. I turned around to check the floor again, and the water had already doubled, rising fast enough to slosh when I shifted my weight. I shouted for help. The street was empty, not even a car passed by. I pulled my phone from my bag, but the screen flickered twice and died. Useless. The bag felt heavier, soaked through, but I still held it close, maybe out of instinct. I leaned my back against the door and did everything I could think of, kicking the lower panel, slamming my elbow against the window, banging the metal frame with my heel. It felt like the booth absorbed every impact. The water crept to my ankles, swirling around with that same strange warmth. I kept telling myself it had to be a busted pipe, some city plumbing issue forcing water up through the drainage under the booth. But why did the flow increase when the rain outside lightened? After a few minutes, my breathing grew shaky and my thoughts scattered. I stood on my toes, staring at the narrow seams where glass met metal, hoping to see some gap I could pry open. The water kept rising, and I kept hearing that steady bubbling sound, almost like boiling. I tried to steady myself, whispering, calm down, but it didn't help. My knees were submerged, and I felt the water lift my bag slightly, buoyant like a balloon. The warmth felt wrong, comforting, in a way that made my skin crawl. I reached behind me again, gripping the handle and pulling so hard my wrist cracked. Nothing. No movement, no escape. I don't know how long I shouted. My voice echoed strangely, as if the booth were larger than it was. The sound didn't bounce the way it should have. It felt swallowed, absorbed. I remember slamming both hands against the glass, waving to a man who passed with his hood pulled low. He didn't look. He didn't even slow down. I started screaming again, pounding with my fists until they hurt, but he just turned the corner. At that point, the water reached mid-thigh, and the warmth made my heart thud in my ears. I kept imagining the booth filling fully, covering my chest, my mouth, my eyes. I begged the door to open. I begged the rain to stop. I begged for anything that made sense. Then something shifted, not in the water, but in the booth itself. A faint vibration pulsed under my feet, like a distant generator humming below the floor. The glass panels trembled for a second, and the warm water surged upward another few centimeters. I clutched the phone box for balance and stared at the door. I tried to convince myself the vibration was normal, part of the drainage system overflowing because of the storm. But deep down, something felt intentional about the way the water climbed, the way the booth sealed itself, the way the outside world ignored me as if I wasn't there at all. My mind raced through every possibility, from broken pipes to electrical failures. But none explained why the water rose only inside the booth, perfectly contained, defying every natural direction gravity should have taken it. My legs were shaking so much I could barely stand. I forced myself to breathe slowly, pressing my forehead to the cold glass again, trying to stay conscious. When I lifted my head, I saw 2 police officers approaching from down the road. Their flashlights bobbed through the rain, and I hammered on the glass again, shouting their way. For a horrible moment, I thought they would walk past too. But one of them lifted his head and pointed. I watched them hurry toward me, confusion on their faces. I banged harder, tears blurring my vision, but right when they reached the booth, something changed. Not gradually, instantly. The water vanished. It didn't drain or lower or ripple. It simply wasn't there anymore. My legs were dry, my shoes weren't squishing, and the floor gleamed as if it had just been wiped clean. I stared down, stunned and trembling. The officers tried the door from the outside, and it swung open easily. Just like that, no resistance, no struggle. I stepped out on shaky legs, gripping the frame for support. One officer asked if I was hurt, and I told him I'd been trapped, that water filled the booth to my knees, that the door wouldn't move. They both exchanged a look, then stepped inside. They pointed out the dry floor, the lack of any puddle, the absence of moisture on the walls or ceiling. Not a drop remained. When I whispered that it was warm water, rising from the metal floor, they examined the base with their flashlights. Nothing. No leak, no pipe, no malfunction, just a clean, dry booth. I didn't know what to say or how to defend myself. The fear, the panic, the rising water, all of it felt suddenly fragile, like something I imagined. But then one officer stepped back outside and asked, "Is that your bag?" My school bag floated in the gutter, drifting slowly along with the rainwater on the street. The straps were soaked, and the books inside sagged with weight. But the bag itself was outside the booth. I didn't remember dropping it. I didn't even remember letting it go. All I knew was that it had floated away with enough force to carry it several meters down the road. When they handed it to me, I felt the warmth radiating from the fabric, the same warmth the rising water had carried. I didn't mention it. I couldn't. Not when everything else had erased itself so cleanly. They insisted on giving me a ride home, and I didn't argue. I sat in the back seat, holding the warm bag on my lap, watching the booth fade behind us through the rain-streaked window. Even then, even now, I still don't fully understand what happened. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And I know the warmth of that water wasn't just in my imagination. I've never stepped inside a phone booth since, and I never will. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard my daughter's voice outside, sharp and strained, like she'd been shouting for minutes. It startled me so much I dropped the cloth. I remember standing there, frozen, thinking I imagined it because she'd already been missing for 8 hours and every sound had started to feel like her. But then I heard it again, "Mama, help me," and something inside me just reacted before I could think. I ran out the door without a jacket, calling her name, scanning every corner of the yard. The neighborhood felt too quiet for how loudly she had screamed. I kept yelling for her, turning in circles until her voice came again, weaker than before. And this time I could tell it was coming from the drainage gutter near the sidewalk. For a second I thought maybe someone was playing a cruel trick, but her tone, that desperate crack she always got when she cried, I knew it, and it punched me straight in the chest. I rushed to the gutter and dropped to my knees, ignoring the cold soaking through my clothes. The metal grate covered the opening, but when I leaned close, her voice rose directly from the darkness below. "Mama, please, it's cold." My hands shook as I tried lifting the grate, but it was bolted down. I kept telling her I was there, that I was getting her out, but panic made my voice tremble. I pressed my cheek close to the metal, calling her name again and again. Then something moved in the dark space beneath me. I swear, I saw a small hand reaching upward, fingers splayed, trembling like she was trying to find mine. I jerked back instinctively, not because it scared me, but because the moment I saw that hand, the voice changed. It stopped sounding like a cry and started sounding like someone whispering the words instead of feeling them. I forced myself to lean in again, taking a slow breath to steady my thoughts. "Sweetheart, I'm here. I need you to talk to me. Are you hurt?" The hand curled slightly as though responding to my voice, and the whisper came again. "Mama, come down." The words didn't make any sense. She was 9 years old. She barely understood how drainage systems worked, let alone telling me to go down into one. I kept thinking, maybe she was in shock or confused. Or maybe she'd fallen into a different opening and somehow crawled toward this point. My heart wouldn't let me doubt her. I ran to my neighbor's house, hammered at the door until he answered, and begged him to help me get the grate off. He grabbed tools and followed me, and the whole time I kept shouting down to her, trying to keep her talking, needing to hear that voice. But when we got back to the gutter, her crying had turned into something quieter, like she was humming through tears. My neighbor frowned at me, asked if I was sure I heard something. I didn't even respond. I knelt again, gripping the metal, and called to her with every bit of strength I had. The humming stopped instantly, and she whispered, "Mama, hurry." My neighbor heard it. I saw the color drain from his face. He muttered something under his breath, then jammed a wrench into the bolt to loosen it. I worked on the other side with trembling hands, every turn of the tool feeling like a fight against time. When the final bolt came loose, we lifted the grate together and set it aside. The opening was just wide enough for an adult to slide into with some effort, and without hesitating, I started lowering myself feet first. My neighbor grabbed my arm, saying, "Wait, let me go first," but I yanked free. I wasn't thinking rationally, only that my daughter was down there, and I needed to reach her. The tunnel was slick and narrow, the wet metal walls freezing against my hands as I steadied myself. The smell was sharp and murky, but none of it mattered. All I cared about was that faint sound ahead of me, her voice, echoing like she was somewhere deeper inside. I kept shouting that I was coming, trying to follow the sound, crouching, crawling, scraping my knees on jagged metal. The tunnel forked in 2 directions, and I hesitated until her voice came again, so close it felt like she was just around a bend. I crawled faster, ignoring the pain in my palms. Then something moved behind me, a quick tap on the metal, like a finger flicking the pipe. I turned, shining the dim light from my phone back down the tunnel I'd just come through. But there was nothing. I told myself it was just water dripping. I kept moving until the tunnel ended abruptly at a dead wall. The sound of her voice bounced faintly around me, but it felt wrong, like it wasn't coming from in front of me anymore, but from above. I pressed my hand against the wall, leaning in, trying to listen. That's when her whisper turned sharp. "Mama, you're going the wrong way." I spun so fast I slipped, landing hard on my elbow. The words echoed, but they didn't feel like they belonged to a child struggling in a cold tunnel. They sounded too calm, too steady, almost like someone was repeating a recording of her voice. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time since she went missing, fear overshadowed hope. I whispered her name again, barely louder than a breath. The tunnel vibrated with a low, raspy response. "Come back." I backed away, inching toward where I'd come from, keeping my light fixed ahead. I didn't know what I expected to see, but I knew something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Then I saw it, a small hand gripping the tunnel floor just around the corner. But the arm was too long for a child, stretched unnaturally, the elbow bending where no joint should bend. The hand flexed, dragging slightly across the metal toward me. I choked out a scream and scrambled backwards so fast I tore skin from my palms. I kept pushing myself, one hand, one knee, one elbow, scraping, slipping, desperate to reach the surface. My neighbor's voice boomed from above, asking if I was okay. I yelled for him to pull me out. The thing behind me scraped along the tunnel, the sound quickening, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the opening, hands grabbed mine, rough, familiar, human, hauling me up onto the street. I collapsed against the pavement, gasping, trembling violently. My neighbor kept asking what happened, but I couldn't form any words beyond, "She's not there," and something else. He leaned down to peer inside the opening, but I grabbed his shirt and begged him not to look. Whatever I saw, I didn't want anyone else seeing it. While he called the police, I sat there, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the black drain, half expecting that hand to reappear. Officers arrived, searched the system, sent people into the tunnels with lights, dogs, equipment. They found nothing. No child, no prints, no clothing, not even the scraped marks, I swear, that hand left on the metal. They gently implied panic, could make the mind twist sounds, distort shapes. I didn't argue. I couldn't. 2 days later, when the police knocked on my door again, I thought it was to ask more questions. Instead, they told me my daughter had been found alive, unhurt, wandering near the edge of town. I ran to the station, hugged her so tightly she squeaked. She was dazed but smiling at me, like nothing had happened. When I asked her where she'd been, she said she woke up in an abandoned storage lot and didn't remember how she got there. But then she looked at me with this confused little frown and said, "Mama, I heard you calling me. From underground. I tried to go to you, but I couldn't find the door." I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't called her from anywhere underground. I hadn't even left the house before she disappeared. I asked her what she meant, but she just repeated it the same way she heard my voice calling her name. Calling for help, humming like I used to hum when she was a toddler. She said it felt close, almost like I was right under her feet. She didn't seem frightened by it. That might have scared me more than anything else. I didn't tell her what I heard or what I saw in that gutter. I still don't know what mimicked her voice or what made her hear mine. I only know that something wanted us underground, both of us, and it tried to use our voices to do it. I keep thinking about that hand, the way it dragged toward me, the strange length of the arm attached to it, and at night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes swear I hear humming under the floorboards. It's faint, just enough to freeze my breath. I don't go near gutters anymore. I don't let my daughter out of sight. And when it rains, I turn up the music loud enough to drown out anything else, because deep down, I know that voice, whatever it was, didn't stop calling. It's still waiting for one of us to answer. I was already irritated when the wipers started dragging across the windscreen like they were made of sandpaper. And I remember leaning forward in my seat, squinting, trying to see the curve ahead when those blue and red flashes went off behind me. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been speeding, and no one else was even out there on that stretch between Wakefield and Nelson. Still, I slowed the rig, telling myself it was probably a routine check or maybe some flood-related warning. The tires hissed on the wet asphalt as I eased to the shoulder, heart beating harder than it needed to. I couldn't see the officer through the mirrors at first, and for a moment I wondered if the lights were reflecting off something else. Then the beam of a torch cut through the rain and swept across my cab. I rolled the window down halfway, trying not to sound annoyed as I called out, "Evening, officer. Everything all right?" He stepped into the glow of his own torch, and something in my stomach tightened. The uniform looked perfect, not worn, not new, just perfectly preserved, but his expression didn't match the moment. He stared like he already knew me. When he didn't say anything, I added, "Was I drifting? Did I miss a sign back there?" Still nothing. His face was almost calm, but not the way a calm person looks, more like someone acting calm without knowing how it's supposed to sit on a human face. He finally lifted the torch slightly and said, "License." His voice felt too flat, like each word had been practiced. I reached for my wallet, fighting the urge to shut the window completely. The temperature around him felt colder than the rest of the night. I passed over my license, and he didn't even look at it. He just held it loosely, fingers too still, arm too stiff, as if the gesture was a costume he hadn't worn enough times to make natural. When I asked what the stop was for, he tilted his head a little, like a dog hearing a strange whistle. "Routine," he answered. That was it. No explanation, no usual steps. I glanced at his chest unconsciously, expecting a badge number under the rain-soaked fabric, but there was nothing. A clean patch of uniform where an ID should have been, as if it had been removed carefully. I felt a pulse of adrenaline and forced myself to stay steady. "Is there an issue with my plates?" I asked, stalling for time, trying to think through the strangeness. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked around the front of the truck, dragging the beam of his torch across the grill, the tires, the mudguards, pausing at places that didn't matter. It felt like he was pretending to inspect it rather than actually looking. When he rounded back to my side, he stopped inches from the door and said, "Step out." No explanation, just that command. I hesitated, and that hesitation seemed to interest him more than anything else so far. The torch angled slightly, grazing my face. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. The rain hit the roof above me in sharp bursts, making it harder to think. "Step out," he repeated, For a second, I considered flooring it, but the idea of pushing past a police vehicle, even one that didn't feel right, made my stomach twist. So I opened the door slowly and climbed down, feeling the cold rain hit my neck like needles. Standing next to him made everything worse. He was dry. Not completely, but impossibly dry for someone who had been walking around a storm. Raindrops hit his hat and slid off like they were landing on wax. His shoulders didn't glisten the way wet fabric should. "Walk to the back," he ordered. I told myself to stay calm, to follow directions until I understood what was happening. I stepped around the rig, each footstep splashing, but his didn't make any sound at all. Not a single splash behind me. When we reached the back of the trailer, he stopped me with a lifted hand. "Open it," he said. That jolted me. "It's sealed freight," I answered. "You need authorization for me to break." He moved closer until his face was only a hand's breadth from mine. "Open it." The same tone, the same unnatural calm. Something primal in me woke up. I backed up, ready to run toward the cab, but he grabbed my arm, not roughly, but with an impossible strength that didn't match his frame. My boots slid slightly in the slick mud as I tried to pull free. Then, headlights appeared in the distance, behind his patrol car. A second vehicle was approaching, slowly, cautiously. The officer's grip loosened almost instantly, and he stepped back, no change in expression. No sign he even noticed the car, but something about it made him release me. I used the moment to pull away and shout, "Hey! Over here!" The oncoming lights paused, then inched forward. The impersonator, because that's all he could be, turned his head toward the car and then back to me, evaluating something I couldn't understand. He walked past me without a word, heading to his patrol car. I expected him to get inside, but he didn't. He stood beside the door, hand on the handle, watching the approaching driver who was now honking lightly, probably trying to figure out why two vehicles were stopped out here. The officer finally opened the door, slid inside without hesitation, and drove off. No acceleration, just a smooth glide into the darkness as though the tires never touched water at all. The rain swallowed the lights completely. The driver who'd stopped got out and jogged toward me, shouting through the rain, "You all right, mate?" I nodded, though I didn't feel all right at all. My hands were shaking as I told him what happened. He frowned and said he hadn't seen the patrol car leave, he just saw me alone by the truck. But I didn't argue. I was too wired, too desperate to get back into the cab. He waited until I drove off first, assuring me he'd follow until we reached town. I didn't refuse. I needed another human presence behind me, even if only on the road. I went straight to the Nelson police station as soon as I reached the outskirts. My clothes were still damp, and I probably looked like I'd crawled out of a ditch. When I described the uniform, the missing badge number, and the questions the officer never answered, the constable on duty went still. He asked me to repeat the part about the uniform design. I described the hat, the jacket, the trim. He exchanged a glance with another officer, then told me quietly that the uniform I was describing hadn't been used since 1978. I felt the cold return. "So, who stopped me?" I asked. He folded his arms and said, "There was a case back then. A man impersonating patrol officers on rural roads. He pulled over truckers at night, just like you. He'd question them, check their cargo, sometimes insist on opening trailers. No one was ever hurt, but he terrified people. Police never caught him. He stopped suddenly after an accident on the highway." I swallowed hard. "What kind of accident?" He hesitated, then said, "Patrol car versus logging truck." The impersonator died instantly. I didn't believe him at first. Or maybe I didn't want to. I kept insisting it must have been someone else, some copycat, somebody messing with me, but the officers shook their heads. No one used that uniform anymore. No one had a legal reason to be out there. And the patrol car, I described the exact model, had been retired decades earlier. They checked the footage from the highway cameras. Nothing showed a patrol car behind me. Nothing showed me pulling over. The only visible headlights belonged to my truck and the driver who came to help. The part that bothers me most isn't the missing footage or the vanished car. It's that moment when he let go of my arm and stepped back like he sensed something approaching long before I did. Almost like whatever he was, or whatever remained of him, didn't want an audience. I've driven that road hundreds of times since, and every now and then, When the night is especially quiet and the rain hits just right, I still glance into the mirrors, expecting to see those blue and red lights appear again, waiting for me to stop. I realized something was wrong the moment my foot brushed against the umbrella lying in front of my apartment door. I hadn't brought one with me that morning, and no one on my floor ever left things in the hallway. The carpeting was usually empty except for the fire extinguisher cabinet. I picked the umbrella up, already uneasy, because it wasn't just lying there, it was placed neatly, almost deliberately, with the handle aimed toward my door like someone had set it down for me to notice. I remember pausing with my keys in my hand, feeling that creeping tension in my stomach, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder even when you know it's pointless. When I carried the umbrella inside, water dripped from the fabric onto my floor. That struck me as odd because the storm had stopped nearly 30 minutes earlier, and the hallway outside had been completely dry. I held it over the sink and shook it out, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor mixed up their floor. But I didn't recognize the pattern on it, a dark navy with thin silver stripes spiraling down. It looked expensive, not the sort of thing someone would misplace without coming back immediately. I remember setting it aside and trying to move on with my routine. I heated leftovers, changed into sweatpants, and tried to focus on a spreadsheet I'd brought home from work. But my attention kept drifting back to the umbrella on the chair. The way it sat there felt wrong, like an object out of place in a room you know too well. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like it was waiting for me to look closer. Eventually, curiosity pushed past the unease. I opened the canopy slowly, half expecting something to fall out. Nothing did. But when I tried to fold it back, my thumb grazed something beneath the curved wooden handle, a tiny ridge. I turned the umbrella over, running my fingers along the underside until I found a thin plastic seam that didn't match the design. I pressed on it lightly. A small panel snapped open, revealing a tiny black lens, no larger than a button. For a few seconds I just stared at it, too stunned to process what I was seeing. A recording device, embedded inside the handle, pointed upward, angled perfectly to capture the hallway outside my apartment door. My heart began pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I kept thinking, why me? Who would do this to me? I hadn't told anyone on my floor about my life, and my coworkers barely knew anything beyond my name and job title. I forced myself to pull the small module out. It was warm, faintly humming, still recording. There was a micro SD card slotted into the side. My hands were shaking when I carried it to my laptop. I remember talking aloud to myself, it's probably nothing. Maybe it fell out of someone's bag, even though I didn't believe a word of it. I inserted the card. A single folder appeared. One video, time-stamped from the previous night at exactly 2:09 a.m. When I opened it, I felt my body go rigid. The footage showed the hallway outside my apartment. The angle was slightly tilted, like the umbrella was propped carefully against the doorframe. The recording was in color, grainy but clear enough. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then a figure stepped into view, approaching slowly from the far end of the corridor. My breath caught in my chest. The person wasn't just walking toward my door, they were dressed in something I recognized instantly. My childhood school uniform, the same navy skirt, the same white button-up with the thin blue piping along the collar. The same model of shoes I hadn't worn in over 20 years. Even the ribbon tied around the neck was identical. But it wasn't a child approaching my door. It was an adult. The height, posture, and deliberate slowness made that clear. I whispered, "No. No. That's impossible." The figure stopped right in front of my door and leaned forward, examining the handle, the lock, the small peephole. The recording didn't capture a face, their head stayed angled just enough to hide it. Then the person knelt, placed the umbrella carefully against my door, adjusted the position twice, and walked away without a single pause. I replayed the video 3 times, searching for anything that could explain it. A prank, a staged costume, some delusion brought on by stress, but every detail in that uniform matched the version worn at my school before they updated the design in 2003. It wasn't something you could find online easily, especially in Belgium, and I had never shared photos of myself as a child anywhere public. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, replaying the image of that uniform over and over in my mind. My childhood hadn't been something I talked about often, especially the parts tied to who I was before transitioning. The uniform represented a version of me I had buried carefully, a version that brought back memories I had fought hard to soften. Seeing it worn by a stranger outside my door felt like someone had dug into a closed-off box inside my life and tugged the lid open without permission. I didn't want to call the police. That was my first instinct, but I knew how these conversations usually went. A mysterious umbrella, a figure in an old uniform, a hallway camera that wasn't the building's property. I could already hear the officer's strained patience. Instead, I walked to my door and peered through the peephole. Nothing unusual. The corridor was silent, dim, completely still. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. I moved a chair beneath the handle, not because I thought it would help, but because it made me feel marginally more in control. I paced my living room, replaying the footage mentally until every second felt burned into my memory. At some point, exhaustion won. I fell asleep on my couch, with my laptop still open, the paused video staring back at me. When I woke up, the first thing I heard was a faint tapping sound near my front door. Slow, inconsistent, like someone touching the door lightly with their fingertips. I froze, listening, barely breathing. The tapping continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. No one. But the umbrella was back outside, standing perfectly upright this time, leaning with an unnatural balance, as though someone had placed it there carefully or as though it had been waiting. The handle pointed upward, facing the peephole directly. That was the moment everything clicked into a terrifying shape. Somebody wanted me to look at that umbrella. Someone wanted me to watch the recordings. Someone wanted me to know they had been here, that they could come back, that they knew things I had never spoken aloud. I unlocked the door just long enough to pull the umbrella inside. I checked the handle. The compartment was empty now. Whoever placed the umbrella outside had retrieved the device. They wanted me to know they controlled the timing, the evidence, the story. Panic settled in my stomach like a cold stone. I realized there was no safety in waiting. I needed answers, even if they scared me. I grabbed my laptop, the umbrella, my jacket, and walked out, heading downstairs to confront the building manager. When I reached the office, it was empty. A paper on the desk said he was off-site until Monday. On my way back up, I noticed something that made my hands go cold. At the bottom of the stairwell was a small patch of water. In the center of the puddle lay a ribbon, the same kind worn with my childhood uniform. It was damp, slightly crumpled, and unmistakably aged, the fabric frayed at the edges as though it had been kept for years. I didn't touch it. I simply backed away, step by step, feeling a sort of calm dread settle over me. Not panic anymore, just a clear understanding. Someone had gone through extraordinary effort to recreate a piece of my past. Someone who knew the uniform, the ribbon, the building layout, my schedule, the way to access my floor without being seen. Someone who wanted me to feel exposed, studied, known. I went back to my apartment, packed a small bag, and left the umbrella behind. I locked the door one last time, knowing I wouldn't return. And here's the part that still unnerves me the most. 3 weeks after I moved out, the new tenant emailed me through the leasing office. They had found something wedged behind the fuse box inside the apartment, a tiny recording device, identical to the one I had pulled from the umbrella. The last timestamp on the footage was 2:09 a.m., the night after I left, and the person placing it wore the same uniform. I caught myself muttering under my breath as I hurried down the narrow street with my hood half falling off, trying to keep my books from getting soaked. I remember brushing my hair out of my face and thinking only about getting back to my apartment before the storm got worse. Nothing felt unusual at first. I was just annoyed, cold, and trying not to slip. Then, as I reached the corner near the old bakery, I heard the low, familiar rumble of the city bus approaching from behind me. It sounded normal enough that I didn't even turn around until the headlights flashed along the wet pavement ahead of me, catching my attention. When I glanced toward the road, I saw the bus slowing down, but not to stop, just enough for me to notice something strange about the way it moved, like it drifted rather than rolled. I stepped closer to the edge of the sidewalk, not because I planned to get on, but because the passing bus usually sent a spray of water toward the buildings, and I wanted to avoid getting splashed. As it came into view, I squinted through the streaks of rain and noticed every window had faces pressed right up against the glass. Completely still, completely silent, dozens of them. They looked directly at me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten immediately. I froze, confused, because no one on a normal bus would stand like that, let alone an entire bus full of people. Their expressions weren't angry or sad, they were blank, but their eyes followed me with a kind of collective focus that felt deliberate. I took a small step backward, hugging my books against my chest, convinced for a moment that maybe there had been some kind of emergency and the passengers were reacting to someone on the street. But there was no one else around, no cars behind the bus, no pedestrians, no reason for that many people to be staring at me. The bus rolled by slowly enough that I locked eyes with at least 5 different passengers. And the longer it passed, the more a cold, instinctive panic pressed up inside my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I needed to understand what I was seeing before I could move. The bus never stopped. It continued past me without opening its doors. Without the usual hiss of the brakes, without the flicker of passengers moving inside, just that line of unmoving faces. As it passed the final stretch of the block, I noticed something else. The digital display that normally showed the route number was completely dark. Not malfunctioning dark. Like the power to that part of the vehicle didn't exist. That detail hit me harder than I expected, and a strange trembling sensation started in my hands. I wrapped my fingers tighter around my books, trying to shake off the feeling. When the bus finally turned at the intersection and disappeared, the street became so quiet it felt unnatural. I kept replaying the sight of those faces in my head, trying to come up with any explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a prank? Maybe a school group or some strange performance art. Maybe the driver missed the stop because of the rain. I tried to reason with myself, but something deeper told me that none of those explanations fit what I had just seen. It felt too synchronized, too deliberate, too wrong. I forced myself to keep walking, but every few steps I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see the bus creeping back toward me. When I reached my building, my fingers fumbled the keys because they were shaking. I didn't calm down until I was inside my apartment with the door locked behind me. Even then, my mind kept flashing back to the moment when all those eyes seemed to move in unison. I made tea, tried to distract myself, but the uneasiness never went away completely. The next morning, I told myself I had overreacted. People stare sometimes. Maybe something unusual was happening inside the bus. Maybe I misinterpreted everything. I convinced myself not to mention it to anyone, afraid they'd laugh or think I was exaggerating. Classes kept me busy most of the day. And by afternoon, the whole thing felt distant enough that I almost dismissed it entirely. But then, when my lecture ended early, I overheard 2 students talking about bus delays and a temporary route closure. That small detail struck me as oddly connected, and curiosity nudged me into stopping by the transportation office near the campus to ask a simple question: which buses had been running the previous night? The woman at the counter barely looked up from her papers when I approached. She had that exhausted expression of someone who had dealt with too many questions already. I asked gently if she knew whether the buses on the coastal side of the city had been operating the night before, specifically around the old bakery intersection. She frowned as if confused. Then she told me that route had been suspended for 2 months due to a landslide that destroyed part of the main road. No buses had passed there at all. Not a single one. I felt my throat tighten immediately. I asked her again, more carefully, explaining the time and location. She shook her head firmly and said it was impossible. I thanked her and stepped outside, but the moment the door closed behind me, the same cold dread from the previous night rushed back through me so fiercely that I had to sit down on the bench outside. I hadn't imagined it. I saw that bus. I saw those faces. And now I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely absorbing anything around me. By evening, I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I needed to see the intersection again, even if it meant confronting something I didn't understand. I walked there slowly, watching every passing car, listening for that familiar bus engine. When I reached the spot where I had first seen it, I stood still, staring at the empty street. Nothing unusual. No sign of anything out of place. I almost felt foolish for expecting something to happen. Then I noticed something I had completely overlooked the night before. A large scar of dirt across the hillside beyond the intersection, the exact place where the landslide had occurred. My mind replayed the trajectory the bus had taken, and something clicked painfully inside me. If the landslide had destroyed the road, then the bus couldn't have come from the direction it had appeared. It had nowhere to come from, no path, no access, no explanation. I didn't sleep that night. My thoughts kept circling back to the passengers' faces, especially the way all their eyes had shifted toward me in one synchronized movement. Somewhere between fear and logic, I convinced myself I needed answers, even if those answers led somewhere unsettling. So the next day, I went to the municipal records office to read about the landslide. I told myself I was doing academic research for a project, but both the clerk and I knew it was a flimsy excuse. She handed me the file anyway. Inside the folder were photos of the destroyed road and a list of the casualties. As I skimmed through, my breath caught. The landslide had occurred on a Monday morning, not during the night. It had buried the entire early route bus 41 passengers, including the driver. Every one of them had died before rescue teams could clear the debris. Their faces stared back at me from the newspaper clippings, and I felt my stomach twist. They were the same faces I had seen pressed against the windows the night before. I pushed the folder away, my heart beat so loud I could hardly hear anything else. Even if I had somehow confused things, even if my mind had exaggerated the familiarity of those faces, nothing could explain the presence of that bus on a closed route. Logic had no room left in what I was discovering. I packed the documents back into the folder with trembling hands and thanked the clerk, even though my voice barely came out. The following days turned into a haze of anxiety. Every time I walked near that intersection, I scanned the street, waiting for something, anything, to reappear. Nothing did. Part of me hoped I'd imagined it all, while another part feared it might happen again. But the situation reached its peak one night when I woke up abruptly from shallow sleep and heard a faint, distant rumble outside. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. It was the unmistakable engine sound of a city bus idling somewhere on my street. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at my window, listening to that low hum. It grew louder, gradually, until I could swear it was right outside my building. With every breath I took, my chest tightened, as if my body already knew what I would see if I dared to look. But I had to. I forced myself out of bed and stepped toward the window as quietly as possible. My fingers gripped the curtain, and I hesitated before pulling it back. The street was empty. No bus, no headlights, no movement. But the engine noise was still there, vibrating faintly under my feet. It felt as if it came from somewhere beneath the ground, like the remnants of something passing through rather than on the surface. I stood frozen until the sound gradually faded away. When silence finally returned, I backed away from the window, slid down to the floor, and sat there for a long time, unable to process anything further. That was the moment I realized something definitive. Whatever I had seen hadn't been a hallucination, a trick of the light, or a coincidence. It was tied to something that had already happened, something irreversible, something tragic. The bus I saw wasn't a warning or a message. It was simply following its route, the same route it had taken on the morning it was buried. A route now gone, carved out of existence, yet somehow still imprinted into the city's pattern, repeating itself in ways I could never have anticipated. I didn't tell anyone for years. I carried it quietly, convinced no one would believe me, or worse, that they would question my sanity. It wasn't until much later, long after I moved to another country, that I finally accepted the truth in a way I could live with. What I saw wasn't supernatural in the sense of ghosts or hauntings. It was something more tragic than frightening. A moment caught between time and loss, a routine that continued even after every person involved had already vanished. Sometimes, when I think back on it, I wonder why the passengers looked at me the way they did. I don't believe they wanted anything from me, or that they recognized me. But I do believe they saw me the same way I saw them, someone living on the other side of something they couldn't escape, a brief crossing of paths between the living and the lost. And even though I never saw that bus again, I can't walk past a quiet street at night without remembering the weight of those eyes, the silence inside that passing vehicle, and the feeling that some journeys don't end just because the road does. I'd been grading essays at my kitchen table when the first knock hit the front door sharp, frantic, and too close together to be anything casual. I remember pausing mid-sentence, pen still hovering over a paragraph about Shakespeare, trying to decide whether I'd imagined it. Then it came again, harder this time, like the knuckles were desperate or hurting. I pushed my chair back and went to the door. Already uneasy because nobody ever came by unannounced at night, not in my quiet little street on the edge of Ballarat. When I opened it, a man stood there, completely drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping off him like he'd climbed out of a lake instead of walking down a suburban road. He kept his head slightly bowed, but his voice came out quick and shaky. "Please, mate, let me in. Just for a minute. I live next door. Something's wrong." I'd never seen him before. Not once, and I'd lived beside that house for nearly 5 years. Nobody lived there. It had been empty the entire time, curtains drawn, mailbox sealed, windows dusty, a for-lease sign that had fallen over 2 summers ago and never been replaced. I told him exactly that, and he shook his head violently, water spraying off him. No, that's my place. Right there, just open your door, please. They're not letting me inside." The way he said "they" made something cold slip into my stomach. I glanced toward the house, mostly out of instinct, and nothing looked different. No lights, no movement, just the dark outline of a place I'd long stopped noticing. I kept my hand on the doorframe and told him I could call someone for him, maybe a friend or the police if he needed help. He stepped closer like he might force his way in if I hesitated. "Don't call them. Just open the door. I'm freezing. You don't understand. They locked me out. They don't want me going back in." His breathing was all over the place, shallow and panicked, and the way he kept his eyes flicking toward the house made me feel like I was missing something important. I took a small step back without meaning to, and he noticed. His expression shifted, not angry, exactly, but almost terrified that I was about to close him out. He put his hand flat on the door, water running down his arm. "Please, I'm not a bad bloke. I just need to get inside for a minute. 1 minute. I'm not lying, that's my house." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a second I wondered if he was drunk or had been in some kind of accident. But he didn't smell like alcohol, and there wasn't a scratch on him. Just soaked clothes, and a kind of trembling that didn't look like fear of the cold, but fear of something unseen. I told him I couldn't let him in, but I could call emergency services. Before he could argue, I stepped back and closed the door, not slammed, just enough to break the conversation. He immediately started knocking again, harder, more frantic, shouting my name even though I never gave it to him. That made everything inside my chest tighten. I picked up the phone and called the police, explaining that a man claiming to be my neighbor was outside and refusing to leave. The operator told me to stay inside and wait. They'd send someone right over. While I waited, the knocking stopped. That silence made my nerves even worse, so I went to the living room window and pulled 2 fingers under the curtain just enough to glance outside. I swear I nearly jumped. He was standing dead still in my yard, looking straight at my window, like he'd been waiting for me to check. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stared, his soaked clothes clinging to him, his breathing visible in faint jerks. I let the curtain fall and stepped back, heart running too fast. I kept reminding myself he was probably just unstable or confused, nothing supernatural or dramatic, but something about his stillness made me feel like logic wasn't going to explain this. When the police car finally rolled up, lights flashing quietly, I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath the whole time. 2 officers stepped out and walked toward him while I opened the door just enough to watch. One asked him something I couldn't hear, and the man pointed toward the empty house, nodding rapidly, trying to explain. The officers listened, exchanged a glance, then asked him to walk over to the house with them. He hesitated like he didn't want to go near it, but they insisted. As they crossed the yard, I stepped out farther onto my veranda. They shined their torches through the windows, checked the front door, and spoke quietly to each other. It was clear they weren't finding anything. Finally, one officer waved me over, so I put on my jacket and walked across the grass. The man was hugging himself, shaking, muttering, "It's mine, it's mine, why are they saying that?" The officer lowered his voice when I approached. "Sir, this house has been vacant since 1982. No active lease, no power, no water. It's been inspected multiple times. There's no sign anyone lives here." I told him I already knew that, and he nodded, lips tightening. Then he asked the man for identification. The man wiped his face with trembling fingers and said he'd left his wallet inside when they shut the door on him. The officers exchanged another look, the kind that says they both think the same thing but can't say it in front of a civilian. They asked him for his name. He hesitated, then whispered something too low for me to hear. The officer repeated it out loud, a puzzled frown on his face. The surname, I recognized it. A family that had lived in that house decades ago. A fire had destroyed half the interior. The newspapers back then reported they'd moved away afterward. I remember that detail because I'd seen an old clipping when researching the area before buying my place. The officers didn't seem to know that history, but the man looked at me like I should understand. "You know me," he said quietly. "I live there. I've always lived there. They locked me out tonight. They don't want me coming back." The moment he said they, his voice shifted from panic to something like mourning. Something so defeated it made my stomach twist. The officers guided him away from the house, telling him they'd take him somewhere warm and safe for the night. He didn't fight them. He just kept saying the same thing, that he lived next door, that something inside didn't want him anymore. He watched me the entire time they led him to the car. Not angry, not pleading. Just a look of someone watching, the only person who might believe him. After they left, I went back into my home, feeling strangely unsettled. I couldn't stop thinking about the surname he'd given. I went through my boxes in the hallway closet, old settlement documents, newspaper photocopies, everything I'd collected when I first moved in. After 20 minutes of digging, I found the article. The address matched. The family's last name matched exactly what the man had whispered, but the most disturbing line was at the bottom. It listed the family members who had moved away: mother, father, 2 daughters, no son. But the article wasn't about the move. It was about the fire. The living room had been destroyed. One person had been hospitalized, a boy, 17. His injuries had been severe. He died 2 days later. His name was the name the man had given. The logic-loving part of my brain immediately told me it had to be coincidence or mishearing. Memories get twisted, especially from old clippings. People misidentify themselves when they're in distress. But another part of me, the part that had seen the man staring into my window, the part that had heard the desperation when he said someone locked him out, couldn't shake the feeling that his presence didn't make sense in any ordinary way. The next afternoon, I called the station to check on him, worried he might have been released without help. The officer told me they never brought anyone in from my address. I insisted 2 officers had come. A man had been escorted into their car. The officer paused, then said they'd sent a team out, but nobody was found. No one was taken away. The officers checked the property and reported it clear. He asked if maybe the man left before they arrived. I told him I'd watched them lead him to the car. He said the patrol log didn't reflect that. Not a single mention. For the next week, I couldn't look at the house without remembering how the man had pointed at it like he still belonged inside. Every night, I double-checked the locks. I told myself he must have wandered off, that the police simply missed him, that trauma or mental confusion explained everything. I even convinced myself of it for a while. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a single knock on my front door. Not frantic, not loud. Just one, like someone gently reminding me they were still there. When I opened it, no one waited outside. But across my yard, the door of the vacant house stood slightly open for the first time in all the years I'd lived there, moving just enough in the breeze to make a soft, repeated tap against the frame. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed my own door quietly, wishing I'd never answered the first knock at all. Something felt wrong the moment my son stepped through the door that night, clutching his violin case like he expected someone to rip it from his hands. He wasn't crying, but he stood there breathing too fast, as if he'd run the whole way home. I remember kneeling in front of him, trying to keep my voice steady when I asked what happened. He didn't answer at first. He just kept glancing toward the window, as if someone might be standing outside. When he finally spoke, he whispered it so quietly that I almost wasn't sure I heard him right. "He keeps following me." I asked who, and he said, "The man with the blue umbrella." I tried not to jump to conclusions, but something about the way he said it, flat, certain, like he wasn't confused at all, made my stomach tighten. I asked where he'd seen him, and he said, "Every street I walked on, every turn." He wasn't walking fast. He just stayed behind me. I kept my voice calm and asked if the man ever spoke to him or tried to come close, but my son shook his head. He didn't do anything. He just looked down at the ground. But the umbrella was always there. I tried reassuring him that maybe it was someone taking the same route home, but even as I said it, I felt myself doubting it. My son had never reacted like this to anything before. He wasn't the type to exaggerate. I walked him to the living room and turned on the lights, hoping a normal setting would help settle him. He didn't sit down. He paced in small circles, wiping his fingers nervously on his jeans. I asked if he could tell me exactly where he saw the man. He listed the streets, the alley shortcut, the roundabout near the school, and every time, he said the same thing. He was there, not close, not far, just behind me. I should have called the police right then, but part of me wondered if he was mistaken. That part of me still haunts me. I told him we'd walk the route together the next day to see if we could figure out what he saw, and he begged me not to. "If we go back," he whispered, "he'll see me again." That night, I let him sleep in my room. He didn't argue or pretend he was too old. He just climbed into my bed and curled up, facing the door. I barely slept, lying there listening for any sound outside, imagining a blue umbrella leaning under every street lamp. Every time a car passed, I sat up, waiting for some shape to appear behind the curtains. Nothing did, but my nerves stayed tight until morning. The next day, I kept him home. I told him it was because I wanted us to have a quiet day, but the truth was, I didn't want him walking alone anywhere. When he finally fell asleep on the couch that afternoon, I slipped out to his school and asked to view the security footage of the area around dismissal time. The guard knew me well enough not to question it. We scrubbed through the footage until we spotted my son walking out into the drizzle, hoodie pulled over his head, violin case bouncing against his side. Then, a few seconds later, a blue umbrella appeared behind him. I leaned closer. The guard did the same. The umbrella stayed at the edge of the frame, bobbing gently as though someone were carrying it, but the angle should have shown at least a silhouette underneath. There was nothing, just the umbrella floating at shoulder height. The guard frowned, rewound, played it again. Same thing. Blue fabric, raindrops hitting it, but no supporting arm, no figure beneath, no hint of a body. The guard muttered something about a camera glitch, but even he didn't sound convinced. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked for permission to check footage from the surrounding streets. He hesitated until I mentioned that a child felt threatened. That swayed him. He pulled footage from every street my son had mentioned. And in each one, the same thing. My son walking, looking back, speeding up. And that umbrella always showing up half a minute later. Steady and precise, not drifting like an object blown by wind. At one point, the umbrella passed directly under a lamppost, and its shadow appeared on the pavement unmistakably shaped as if a person was holding it. But again, there was no person. My throat went dry. The guard kept glancing at me like he hoped I had an explanation. I didn't. Not one that made sense. Not one I wanted to say out loud. When I got home, my son was awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, with his knees pulled up. He asked where I'd gone. I told him I checked the cameras. He went completely still. I didn't want to lie to him, so I told him the truth, that I saw the umbrella behind him. But the cameras didn't show the man. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, in a small voice I'd never heard from him before, "So he's hiding from everyone, not just me." I asked him if the man ever tried to get closer. He shook his head. "No, he stays far. But he always knows when I'm about to turn, even when I didn't plan it. He's already there." I didn't understand what he meant, and he struggled to find the words. "It's like he knows my path before I walk it." That night, he refused to go near any windows. Every time I drew the curtains, he double-checked them. He didn't want dinner. He didn't want to play anything. He just sat next to me, leaning lightly against my arm, hoping I wouldn't move. I tried contacting the police, but when I mentioned the surveillance footage, they told me glitches happen and suggested I accompany my son to and from rehearsals. That was all. I decided he wouldn't be walking anywhere for a while. For the next few days, I drove him everywhere. I avoided every street where he'd seen the umbrella, but each time we passed the roundabout near his school, my son would grip the seatbelt harder. I didn't ask why. I was too afraid. I already knew. On the 5th day, the rain returned. Heavy, constant, rhythmic. My son stood at the living room window, watching the drops slide down the glass. I was making tea when he whispered my name. I turned. He was staring out into the street with a look I will never forget, not fear exactly, but a quiet, resigned recognition. I walked toward him slowly, bracing myself, praying I was imagining his expression. When I reached the window, he lifted a shaking finger and pointed. A blue umbrella was positioned across the street. Closed. Leaning upright against a lamppost. No one else was outside. No bicycles, no pedestrians. No cars parked close enough for someone to leave it there and vanish instantly. My chest tightened. I stepped closer, scanning the street left to right, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I opened the door before thinking it through. My son grabbed my arm, begging me not to go outside, but I told him to stay behind the door and not move. I stepped into the rain, feeling it soak through my shirt almost immediately. I approached the umbrella cautiously, trying to convince myself it was just an abandoned object. The closer I got, the less that seemed possible. It was standing too perfectly, balanced against the lamppost, as though someone had just stepped away for a second. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. Not like fabric warmed by the sun, warm like something recently held by a living hand. A cold sensation spread across my back. I jerked my hand away. In that instant, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Faint drops of water trailing away from the umbrella. Not random splashes. Footsteps. Human-sized, leading toward the alleyway. I followed them for only a few steps before stopping. The prints ended abruptly, not faded, not washed out, just ended, as if whoever made them stepped off the ground entirely. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the alley. Nothing moved. I grabbed the umbrella, thinking maybe fingerprints would at least prove someone existed. But when I lifted it, the handle snapped cleanly in two, as if it were rotted inside. The fabric drooped. The warmth vanished instantly. I dropped it without realizing. My son was still at the door, pale and rigid. I walked him inside, locked every entrance, and called the police again. They came, checked the area, saw the broken umbrella, saw the faint footprints, and told me they must have washed away unpredictably. They didn't believe me about the warmth. They didn't believe my son's account. They left after half an hour. That night, my son asked me something that shook me. He said, "If he knows my path, does he know where I sleep?" I told him no, but my voice broke, and he heard it. He didn't sleep at all. Neither did I. Over the next weeks, nothing else happened. No umbrella, no sightings, no strange footsteps. My son slowly relaxed. He returned to school. I walked him everywhere. I stayed close. We tried to push the memory away. The resolution came unexpectedly. A technician from the city's CCTV department contacted me after hearing about the footage. He'd reviewed the files frame by frame. He explained that the umbrella wasn't a glitch, it was a real object captured cleanly in every angle. But the absence of the man wasn't supernatural. The cameras had a major blind spot for certain shades of dark fabric due to a manufacturing flaw. Anything matching that shade absorbed infrared light completely. In rare cases, he said, clothing in that range would make a person appear invisible on the footage. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't something impossible. It was a man wearing clothing the cameras couldn't register. A real person followed my son home. A real person anticipated his turns. A real person left that umbrella across our street. Knowing this didn't make me feel safer. It made everything worse. Because they never found him. They never identified him. And we had no idea why he chose my son or why he stopped. But at least we knew what was true. And truth, even when terrifying, is easier to face than imagination. My son is grown now. We moved away years ago, but every time it rains, he still walks a little faster. And I still glance behind us, not for a ghost, not for a shadow, but for a man holding a blue umbrella who learned the shape of my child's path a little too well. I barely had time to yank my suitcase out of the taxi trunk before the rain blurred everything into streaks. And that's when I noticed the man standing under the narrow overhang of the apartment building doorway, watching me like he'd been waiting for exactly the second I arrived. I didn't think much of it at first. São José dos Campos isn't the kind of place where strangers stare with intentions you can read immediately. But something about how still he stood made me pause. I remember shifting my bag to my other hand, telling myself I was being dramatic after a long-haul flight, and walking toward the entrance. When he asked if I had a moment, his voice was calm, almost gentle. And I instinctively stepped closer because he looked drenched and cold, and because my job had conditioned me to help people before questioning them. He said he'd dropped his phone in a puddle and needed to call a ride. I believed him. I shouldn't have. I offered my phone without hesitation. He didn't dial anything. He just held it in his palm, studying the screen, maybe pretending to scroll. That was the first flicker of discomfort. I asked if everything was okay, and he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes, and said he just needed a second to look up the number. It was the way he said "just a second" that made my skin prickle, like he was buying time rather than struggling to remember anything. I shifted my stance, ready to grab my phone back, and that's when I noticed the keychain clipped to the side of the pocket of his soaked jeans. At first, I didn't register it because I wasn't looking for anything like that. But the shape of the tiny golden airplane charm hit me in a way that stole the breath from my chest. I had lost that charm 2 years earlier, and not just the charm, the entire key set. The set with my old apartment key, my locker key, and my luggage key. I'd torn my life apart looking for it, and now it was hanging casually from a stranger's pocket. My voice came out thinner than I wanted when I asked where he got that keychain. He didn't look down. He didn't even pretend. He lifted his eyes slowly, like he'd been waiting for that exact question. The pause between us stretched long enough that I heard the rain hammering behind me, like the moment had been sealed away from the rest of the street. He finally said he'd had it for a while and asked if I liked it. I remember something tightening deep in my stomach. A cold, sharp certainty that nothing about this man standing in front of me was random. I reached for my phone immediately, and he let it go without resistance, but his eyes didn't leave my face once. He kept staring, waiting for me to say something, maybe to confront him directly. I couldn't. I stepped back instead, fumbling for my building keycard, and I told him to stay right there, because I'd call someone to help him. That was a lie. I had no intention of helping him any further. The moment I unlocked the door and slipped inside, he moved closer, not touching the door but standing close enough that if I opened it again, he could have reached in. I pressed my back to the wall, out of his sight through the glass panel, and held my breath until he eventually walked away. But he didn't leave the street. He just crossed near the lamppost and stood again, partly hidden, looking up toward my building like he was waiting for another chance. I took the stairs instead of the elevator because I didn't want to risk the doors opening with him inside. My hands shook as I reached my apartment. I checked the deadbolt twice, then sat in the middle of my living room trying to make sense of what had just happened. My first thought was ridiculous, but it came anyway. Maybe my keychain wasn't mine. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the design existed in other shops, but the logic fell apart instantly. That charm wasn't a popular model. I'd bought it from a small booth in Panama City on a layover. It had a scratch across the left wing, the same scratch I'd stared at every day attached to my keys. The scratch was on his keychain too. I didn't sleep that night. Not even a minute. Every time a car passed or water dripped from the balcony above mine, I jolted up, imagining footsteps outside my door. The next morning I called my landlord and asked if anyone had tried to access the building without permission recently. He said no. But he also mentioned something I wish he hadn't. My old key set wouldn't have worked anymore. But it still technically opened the mailbox slot. I didn't like knowing that. I didn't like knowing someone might have been close enough to reach my personal mail any time in the past 2 years. I also didn't like knowing how long this stranger had possibly been keeping track of me. I didn't go to work for 2 days. I told the airline I was sick. I spent the time walking around my apartment, checking windows and doors, looking outside through the peephole every hour. I filed a police report, but they told me what I already feared. Unless he threatened me directly or stole something provable, there wasn't much they could do. I kept replaying the moment I saw the keychain, the casualness of it, the way he didn't react, like he wanted me to notice. On the third day, something arrived that made everything worse. A small envelope under my door. I didn't hear anyone slide it in. Inside was my old luggage key, the one from the lost set, wrapped in a piece of paper with a single sentence. Thought you might want this back. The handwriting wasn't messy or rushed. It was careful, almost elegant. For a moment, I felt every nerve in my body turn electric. He had been inside the building. He had walked right up to my door. And he knew exactly who I was. I went to stay with my sister after that. She lived across town, far enough that I hoped he wouldn't follow. I told her only part of what happened because I didn't want to scare her unnecessarily, but she insisted I talk to the police again. I did, and this time they took it more seriously because he had entered the building without authorization. They said they'd check nearby cameras. I didn't expect them to find anything, but 3 days later, an officer called me. He asked if I could come in to see footage. I felt sick even before I saw the screen. The footage showed the man standing near a building across the street from mine 1 week before our rainy night encounter. Standing there for almost 2 hours. Not moving. Watching the entrance like he was counting how many people entered. Another clip, from 2 nights before I met him, showed him following a woman who lived on the same floor as me. He didn't approach her, but he walked behind her for several blocks before turning around. It was clear he wasn't waiting for me specifically, he was watching the building in general. But the keychain, that was personal. That was intentional. The police issued a notice to residents, but they still didn't know who he was. The footage didn't show a license plate or any identifying markers. They increased patrols around the area for a while, though the officers warned me it wouldn't last forever unless something escalated. My sister said I should move in with her permanently. I didn't want to uproot my life again. But the thought of returning to my apartment made my stomach twist. I kept imagining him sliding that envelope under the door, bending down silently in the hallway where I slept just a few meters away. I made the decision to move out, and it felt like defeat at first. But then something happened that finally gave me closure. A week after I left the apartment for good, the new tenant called the landlord to report someone lurking around the entrance again. Police arrived fast because they had been monitoring the area more aggressively. They arrested the man. He didn't resist, he didn't speak. And when they searched him, they found 3 keychains clipped inside his bag, including mine, still attached to the apartment key that no longer worked. 2 other sets belonged to past tenants who had filed unrelated complaints about someone entering their mailboxes. During questioning, he said only that he liked keeping pieces of people who stayed in the building. Nothing more. No motive beyond an unsettling obsession with private belongings. No history that explained why he chose that building or why he held on to keys for years. He wasn't connected to any major crimes, just a quiet series of personal invasions. But the officer who spoke with me admitted something that chilled me long after it should have. He watched people for patterns. He waited to see who lived alone, who left early, who came home late. You noticing the keychain early may have stopped something worse. I've thought about that sentence more times than I want to. Sometimes I still reach for my current keys and expect to see that golden airplane charm scratched across the left wing. I don't use charms anymore. I keep my keys plain, unremarkable, easy to forget, easy to replace. And even now, years later, when it rains suddenly and catches me off guard, I still glance around for faces in the crowd, searching for anyone standing too still, watching too closely, carrying something that once belonged to me. Something felt off the moment I stepped into the hall and saw a thin red line snaking across the tiles, weaving toward the front door as though it had been dragged by an invisible hand. I remember calling out to Sarah, asking if she'd spilled something, but my voice sounded strange, in my own ears tight, too thin, like it was refusing to carry the shape of what I already feared. She came out from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, froze when she saw the smear, and whispered, "Is that?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to. I just stepped closer, noticing how the color was diluted, as if someone had mixed it with water. The smell wasn't strong, but there was something metallic beneath the wetness. I crouched, reached out, and touched the edge of it with my fingertips. It was cold. Colder than the floor. Colder than it should have been. I followed the streak toward the door, feeling that awful pull in my stomach that only comes when you suspect the world is about to tilt the wrong way. Outside, the rain hadn't slowed, and the runoff from the street formed small streams that gathered along the pavement before rushing past our doorstep. I stared at the water pooling against our threshold, and that's when I realized the streak wasn't just leading to the door, it was coming from under it. Something from outside had been pushed inside with the flow. I opened the door slowly, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the street was empty. Instead, a thin red rivulet wound down the slope toward our house, traveling with the rainwater like a trail left by someone who had walked bleeding down the street. Only no footprints broke the flow. I stepped out barefoot, ignoring Sarah telling me to wait. The cold water rushed over my feet, carrying the diluted red strands past me. The wind pushed the rain sideways, and I squinted against it as I looked uphill. The street wasn't long, a few houses, a narrow bend, then the rise leveled off toward the small row of shops we always bought meat from. A stronger pulse of reddish water slipped past my ankle, thicker than before, as if something fresh had joined the flow. My mind jumped straight to an accident. A fall, a hit and run. Something logical, something you could report and fix and move on from. So I told Sarah to grab her coat and come with me, because whatever had happened, someone might still need help. We walked uphill together, leaning into the rain, following the stream until it split around a storm drain near the bend. The concentration was stronger there, clinging to the pavement in a darkened smear before thinning again. I kept telling myself it could be anything, paint, dye, something someone spilled, but deep down I already knew the truth. You don't mistake the way real blood moves when you've seen it before. And I had, years ago, on a farm accident my uncle still refuses to talk about. Sarah squeezed my arm, sensing my thoughts, and said softly, "Don't jump to the worst." But the worst was all I could think of. As we rounded the bend, the sight waiting for us made both of us stop. The butcher's shop, McCleary's, sat dark, even though he normally stayed open late on Thursdays. A delivery van was parked at an odd angle beside it, door slightly ajar, as if someone had stepped out in a hurry and never closed it. The stream of diluted red came from behind the shop, trickling along the pavement before joining the rainwater rushing downhill. My chest tightened, and for a moment I just stood there listening to the patter of rain on metal and glass. I told Sarah to stay near the lamppost while I checked the back. She argued, of course she did, but one look at the van's open door made her fall silent. I moved behind the shop, stepping carefully over the small pools forming in the uneven ground. The back door to the butcher's was wide open, not kicked in, just left swinging slightly with the wind. The red stream originated from inside, carrying thin lines of it out into the alley. I called McCleary's name, not loudly, but with that tone you use when you don't want the wrong thing to answer. Nothing came back. The rain weakened for a moment, quiet enough that I could hear a faint dripping from inside, not water, something thicker hitting the concrete one drop at a time. My instinct told me to leave, go back, call the police. But my legs carried me forward anyway, because once you've seen something like that flowing past your doorstep, you need to know its source. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of raw meat, sharper than usual, tinged with something that felt wrong. The lights were off, but the emergency bulb near the back room flickered just enough to show a slumped shape against the counter. For a split second, I thought it was McCleary, resting or unconscious, but as I stepped closer, I realized the shape wasn't a person at all. It was a rolled carcass half prepared, left out of the fridge with the butcher's apron draped over it like someone had been interrupted mid-task. Tools were scattered across the table, not thrown, but abandoned with a strange haste. The dripping sound came from somewhere deeper in the back room, where the dark was thicker. I hesitated at the doorway, legs trembling, skin prickling in a way that felt like my body was pleading with me to stop. But I stepped inside anyway. The dim bulb illuminated part of the floor, and that was enough to see the thick pool forming near the drain. Not diluted, not washed by rain. Fresh. And above it, marks on the floor showed where something had been dragged not cleanly, but with resistance, like dead weight. My throat tightened as I followed the trail with my eyes. It led toward the cold storage room. The door was half open. Something inside shifted, just slightly, enough to make a soft rustle. I backed away instinctively, pressing myself against the wall, listening hard. When the rustle didn't repeat, I forced myself to edge forward, nudging the door wider with my foot. The cold air brushed past me. Inside, the room was almost empty, except for scattered boxes and hooks hanging unused. And in the corner, I saw his jacket, the same one McCleary always wore, crumpled on the ground beside a half-filled crate. No sign of him, no sign of anyone. The dragging marks didn't reach the corner. They ended at the drain in the middle of the floor. Whatever had been moved hadn't been taken into the room. It had been taken out of it. The realization hit me with such clarity that I felt dizzy. Someone had been here before us. Someone strong enough or desperate enough to move a body alone. I stumbled back into the alley, calling for Sarah, telling her to ring the police immediately. My voice must have sounded urgent enough because she didn't even question it. She stepped away to make the call while I stayed near the back door, watching the red stream continue its slow, steady path into the street. When the officers arrived, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I told them everything, step by step, showing them the trail, the van, the room. They searched the entire building while we waited outside under a neighbor's awning. After what felt like hours, an officer returned to tell us what they'd found. Signs of a struggle, evidence of a forced removal, and enough blood to confirm McCleary was badly injured but no body. The investigation continued for weeks, and though the police could trace the blood flow to the drain outside his back door, they never found where the body had been taken. Eventually, they discovered the truth through a neighbor's statement. A man had been seen arguing with McCleary 2 nights before, a former employee with a history of violent disputes. When they finally located him, miles away, he confessed to everything: the confrontation, the killing, the attempt to destroy evidence during the storm, and the dragging of the body to a rented storage unit he believed no one would question. The rain he thought would wash away the crime had instead delivered it to our doorstep. Even now, whenever the gutters overflow or the water runs in little rivers down the slope, I feel that same tightening in my chest. Not because I fear something supernatural or impossible, but because I know what ordinary human desperation can look like when the world goes quiet under the sound of rain. And I can never shake the moment I look down at my feet, watching the water rush past, carrying someone's final traces straight to my home, as if asking to be found. I was halfway down the street when I first heard the ringing, sharp and out of place, cutting through the storm like it was meant only for me. I remember slowing down, blinking rain out of my eyes, wondering who would be calling a public phone at this hour. The booth stood near the corner by the bakery, empty, lit from inside by a weak yellow glow that flickered every few seconds. I never used those things, but the ringing kept going, steady and insistent, like someone knew I was close enough to hear it. I told myself to ignore it and keep walking home. But after a few steps, I stopped again. Something in me, curiosity, stupidity, instinct, I still don't know which made me turn around and walk toward it. Even then, my chest felt tight, as if I already sensed something wasn't right. I pushed the door open, and the moment I stepped inside, the ringing stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like someone had cut a wire the instant my hand touched the metal handle. I remember staring at the black receiver for a full second, breathing hard, trying to laugh to myself but failing. I shouldn't have picked it up, I know that now. But back then, it felt almost rude not to answer after walking back for it. The phone was cold in my hand, colder than it should have been, and for a few moments there was nothing on the line but static. I was about to say hello when the static dropped out completely, replaced by silence, thick, heavy, expectant. Then someone whispered my full legal name, slowly, perfectly, not a nickname, not the shortened version my friends use. The exact name I'd signed on my birth certificate. I froze. The receiver pressed so hard against my ear that it hurt, and I couldn't form a single word. The whisper wasn't threatening or angry, it was worse. It was familiar. I didn't hang up right away. I should have, but instead I whispered back, "Who is this?" hoping there would be some logical explanation. A friend messing around, someone from the newspaper pulling a cruel joke, anything that made sense. But the silence on the other end stayed empty, almost deliberate, as if the person wanted me to listen to their breathing but refused to give me the satisfaction. After a few seconds, the line clicked softly. Not like a drop call, more like someone gently placing their finger on the hook. When I stepped back out into the street, the rain didn't bother me anymore. What bothered me was the feeling that someone had been waiting for me to answer that call, waiting specifically for me, like they knew exactly where I'd be at that exact moment. I practically ran home. And the first thing I did was check every window, every lock, like some paranoid rookie, not a journalist who had covered break-ins, disappearances, and stranger crimes for years. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe someone from the office had followed me. Maybe someone grabbed my employment file. But the tone of the whisper stuck with me, the precision of it, the calmness, the subtle confidence. It wasn't someone guessing, it was someone who knew. I barely slept that night, lying awake, replaying that voice. I kept trying to place it a colleague, a relative, someone I'd interviewed, but there was nothing. Just that eerie sense of recognition without memory, like hearing a tune you know but can't name. The next morning, the phone booth rang again as I walked past it on my way to work. I ignored it. I kept my head down and moved faster. But it rang again the day after that. And again. Always when I walked by. Always during the stormier evenings. And always stopping the moment I stepped inside or approached too closely. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the phone company from my desk, asking if they could trace calls made to that specific booth. They told me no such calls were recorded. According to their system, the booth hadn't received an incoming call in months. I insisted. They double-checked. Still nothing. When I hung up, my hands were shaking so badly I had to shove them under my thighs to still them. That night, instead of walking straight home, I waited around the corner from the booth, keeping it in view. I stayed under a shop awning, partially hidden, watching through a curtain of rain. I expected to see someone standing there dialing, maybe a shadow slipping away each time. But no one approached. Still, the booth began ringing again, the sound echoing down the street, clear and rhythmic. It rang as though an invisible hand lifted and dropped the receiver repeatedly. I watched the door. It didn't open. I watched the windows. No shape moved inside. The booth was completely empty, yet the ringing wouldn't stop. I should have walked away, but I stepped closer. That's when the ringing cut off. Exactly like before. Something inside me snapped, maybe fear, maybe frustration. I stormed into the booth, grabbed the receiver, and hissed, "Tell me who you are." Silence again. Except not quite silence, the faintest sound of someone breathing, slow and steady. I pressed the receiver harder against my ear, my heart pounding as if trying to match the rhythm of that breathing. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. The breathing paused, then resumed, deliberate, almost as if the person was choosing when to inhale. Finally, the whisper came again, but this time, they spoke not just my name, but my home address, down to the flat number. I slammed the phone down so hard I nearly cracked the plastic. I stayed with a friend that night. I didn't tell him everything, just that someone was harassing me. He offered to let me crash on his couch for as long as I needed. For a while, I took him up on it. I changed my route to work. I avoided the entire street with the booth. A week passed without incident, and I convinced myself it had ended. Whoever the caller was had grown bored of me. But the fear hadn't left. I still felt watched, still double-checked my surroundings nervously. And then, one Friday afternoon, the front desk at work called to say there was a phone call for me on line 2. I picked up without thinking, and I heard it the same breath, the same hush, the same chilling whisper of my full name. I dropped the receiver and stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of folders as everyone stared. When I looked at the phone again, the line was dead. I marched straight to the police. I gave them every detail, even the parts that made me sound irrational. They listened politely, took notes, told me they'd look into it, but I could tell they thought I was stressed, overworked, maybe imagining connections that weren't there. And honestly, part of me wondered the same. But one officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, paused before I left and asked me to repeat the name the caller used. When I did, he frowned slowly, like something had clicked in his mind. He hesitated, then asked if I'd ever gone by a different name in public. I told him no. Then he asked if anyone could have forged my documents or accessed hospital records. That question chilled me more than the whisper ever had. He eventually explained that decades ago, there had been a man in Cork with the exact same full name as mine, same spelling, same middle name, who vanished after reporting being followed and harassed by someone calling him repeatedly. The officer didn't know much about the case. It wasn't famous, wasn't widely discussed, but it was documented. The missing man's last complaint had described a phone call from a booth where someone whispered his name. The same booth I'd answered, the same whisper I'd heard. I went home and sat alone for a long time, letting the truth settle like damp air against my skin. The calls didn't come from a stranger who knew my name. They came because I had the name, the wrong name, or the cursed one, or simply the one the caller was still looking for. Someone had mistaken me for a ghost of another man, or worse, believed I was him. And for reasons I can't explain, that realization gave me clarity more than fear. I changed my name within a month. I moved to a different part of the country. And since then, the calls have stopped. The booth never rang again, at least not for me. I still don't know who the caller was, what they wanted, or why the whispers stopped only after I let go of the name. But if there's one thing I'm certain of, it's this. Whoever whispered, it wasn't calling for me. They were calling for the man who had it first. I noticed the movement first, not a sound, not a voice, just the shape of something dragging itself across the gravel toward my porch. I was alone at the reception cabin, finishing the late shift, thinking the night would end quietly. I remember standing there with my hand still hovering over the ledger when the motion caught my eye, and my stomach tightened before my mind even processed why. The silhouette wasn't walking. It was crawling, slow and uneven, like every inch hurt. At first, I told myself it had to be an injured tourist from the trail nearby. People got lost in those mountains every year, especially when they underestimated the terrain. But something about the way he moved felt wrong. Like he wasn't using his arms correctly, or like he didn't fully know how crawling worked. I stepped closer to the door, unsure if I should help or call emergency services first, and that hesitation made everything inside me coil tight. When he finally reached the bottom of the steps, he raised his head just enough for me to see part of his face. Mud coated half of it, smeared so thickly that his features blended together. His hair clung to his skin, his lips were cracked, and his breathing came in strained, shallow bursts. I froze when he looked directly at me, because there was an odd sharpness in his eyes that didn't match the rest of his broken appearance. It was like he was too aware of me, watching too intently for someone in pain. I opened the door but kept my body behind it, trying to stay cautious. "Are you hurt?" I asked, and he nodded without really nodding, more like his head jerked once in response. I reached for my phone, planning to call for medical help, but he lifted his hand abruptly. His fingers trembled as he pointed at me, and the intensity in that gesture stopped me from moving. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. I couldn't understand anything until he forced out a single word that hit me in a way nothing else could have. "Brother." The phone slipped slightly in my hand, and I steadied myself against the doorframe. My brother's name was Daniel, and he died 5 years earlier during a hiking trip in these same mountains. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't something anyone passing through would know either. The hiker coughed, shuddering, and repeated it with more effort. "Your brother." I told myself he must have met someone with the same name, or maybe he was confused and repeating words that sounded familiar. But then he said something I hadn't heard in years, the childhood nickname only Daniel and I used for each other. Hearing it come from a stranger's broken mouth made my whole body go cold. I stepped back instinctively, and the hiker dragged himself one step up the porch. I felt an urge to slam the door, but something deeper held me in place, demanding answers. I crouched a little, keeping distance, and asked him how he knew that name. He swallowed hard, wincing, and spoke in fragments. He helped, showed the path, told me to come. Here. Each word seemed scraped out of him, forced and painful. His voice had an uneven rhythm, like he was repeating something he'd memorized instead of recalling an experience. The more he spoke, the more unsettled I became. Somehow, it sounded like he wasn't describing meeting someone, he was stating instructions. I asked him where he'd seen my brother, and he lifted his arm again, pointing toward the dark tree line behind the staff cabins. Up there, he whispered. He said, "You'd help." My heart pounded as I looked in that direction, even though I knew Daniel wasn't in those mountains. His body had been recovered, his death confirmed by rescuers. Yet hearing a stranger insist he'd been guided by him triggered an old grief I hadn't touched in years. And beneath that grief, a small sliver of dread grew, one that whispered that maybe the man wasn't lying, just repeating something someone else wanted him to say. I told him I'd call for help, but when I lifted my phone again, he panicked. His body jerked violently, and he grabbed the step with both hands as if bracing himself. "No," he gasped. He said, "No police, just you." The certainty in his tone terrified me more than anything else. I'd never heard a dying person so insistent, so focused on giving a message that didn't fit the situation. I asked him again what he meant, and he shook his head, eyes darting toward the darkness behind me. He said, "Hurry before he comes back." That sentence nearly stopped my breathing. "Who comes back?" I pressed, leaning slightly forward despite every instinct telling me to step away. At first, the hiker didn't answer. His chest heaved, and his nails scraped the wood as he pulled himself another inch upward. Finally, he whispered, "The man, he wasn't alone, someone else, was watching us." He trembled harder. He followed, hid, waited, and Daniel said, "Run." My logical mind tried to piece together what he was describing. Maybe he'd been injured and hallucinating. Maybe he'd heard names wrong, or someone used my brother's name in the story of a previous rescue. But the way he said, "watching us," struck something deep in me because Daniel's final rescue report mentioned footprints that didn't match his path. I had dismissed it as irrelevant back then, a hiker passing through. But now, hearing this man describe being followed in the same mountains pulled at every unresolved fear I'd buried. I told him I needed to get the first aid kit from inside, and he nodded faintly. But when I turned, he suddenly grabbed my ankle, grip surprisingly strong for someone so weak. I stumbled but didn't fall. And when I looked down, he stared at me with such desperation that I paused. "He's here," he whispered. "Don't leave me." The certainty in his voice made my skin prickle. I forced myself to stay calm and asked who he meant. But he only shook his head again and whispered my brother's name like a plea. I pulled his hand gently off my ankle and stepped inside, leaving the door slightly open. My heart hammered as I reached for the first aid kit. Every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong, more than an injured man in need of help. I felt watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. When I returned to the doorway, the hiker had managed to crawl fully onto the porch. He was sprawled on his side, breathing heavily. But something about his posture looked unnatural, like he'd been moved rather than crawled by his own strength. I knelt just close enough to inspect his injuries without letting him touch me again. His leg was swollen, possibly broken. His clothes were torn in places, but not in a way consistent with natural falls. It looked more like someone had grabbed him repeatedly, holding on to him with force. And something else bothered me too. His backpack was missing. Most hikers never separated from it unless they dropped it to flee. I asked him if someone hurt him, and his expression shifted. Not fear, not confusion. Something like recognition, as if that question was the one he'd been waiting for. He nodded slowly, eyes locked onto mine. He said, "You'd understand," he murmured. Before I could ask what he meant, he breathed out the last thing I expected. "Same man, followed your brother." My whole body went numb. I wanted to deny it, to push away the idea that Daniel hadn't died from a simple fall. But the hiker's tone carried a horrible clarity. I asked him what the man looked like, but he didn't answer. His eyes drifted over my shoulder, toward the darkness beyond the reception cabin. His pupils widened, and he tried to sit up, panic etched across his face. "He's here," he whispered again. I spun around, searching the darkness, but saw nothing. No movement, no shape, no one watching. When I looked back, the hiker had collapsed fully, consciousness slipping. I called for an ambulance, finally ignoring his earlier warning. By the time help arrived, he was breathing but fading, slipping in and out of awareness. He was taken to the hospital, but he never woke enough to explain more. He died 2 days later from internal injuries. Police searched the trail and found signs of another person's presence: fresh footprints, torn fabric, and drag marks. They never identified the second person. They confirmed the hiker had been chased, maybe assaulted, but they found no evidence connecting anything to Daniel. They told me the man was confused, clinging to any comforting story while dying. They believed he imagined the rest. But I know what I heard. I know the nickname he used, the details he shouldn't have known, and the fear in his voice when he said someone had followed them both. I avoided those mountains for years afterward, knowing the truth police couldn't confirm. Someone was still out there. Not a ghost, not a legend. A real man who had been watching hikers for at least a decade. And if my brother really did help that hiker escape, then he saved one last person by warning him in whatever final moments he had left. I never learned who the follower was. But I do know one thing. Sometimes the person you fear most isn't the one crawling to your door. It's the one standing just far enough away that you never see him, even when he's looking directly at you. I was halfway through drying my daughter's shoes when I realized something about the night was bothering me more than it should have. It wasn't the usual parent panic about lost items. It was the fact that I couldn't picture the exact moment her yellow jacket disappeared during the school event. I remembered helping her hang it on one of those metal hooks, third row, right side. I remembered her running to show me her papier-mâché lighthouse. But everything after that felt fuzzy, like my brain refused to replay it clearly. Even when the teacher said they couldn't find the jacket, I just shrugged it off, thinking we'd grab it the next day. Only later, around 9, when I checked the porch camera out of habit, did I feel something tighten in my chest. The feed looked unusually static and slow, as if freezing on every few frames. I kept checking the footage because the school's Lost and Found had already emailed to say the jacket hadn't turned up. That wasn't unusual, but the sense of dread that crept up my back was. I don't get irrationally anxious, but something in the footage felt wrong. The front steps looked subtly distorted, as though the camera kept trying to refocus on something not quite visible. I tried adjusting the settings, then restarted the feed, then refreshed the page. Nothing changed. My daughter, asleep on the couch by then, kept twitching like she was dreaming about being startled. I glanced at her and told myself I was overthinking. But the knot in my chest only grew tighter as I noticed a faint blur near the porch railing in the playback. I got up and opened the front door, for no real reason other than to reassure myself. Rain had eased into a cold drizzle, tapping softly on the railing. Nothing unusual, no stray animals, no footprints. Not even the smell of wet grass that usually comes after heavy rain. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. At some point, I whispered, "If someone's out here, please don't mess with my kids' things," which sounded ridiculous the second it left my mouth. I shut the door quietly, double-checked the lock, and returned to the couch. My daughter shifted again, mumbling something about her jacket, and I felt a jolt of guilt. Maybe I should have gone back to the school right then. Maybe I should have done anything other than sit there staring at that flickering feed. By 11, I had convinced myself to check the porch one last time before heading to bed. The feed froze completely this time, stuck on a grainy frame of the empty steps. I opened the door with irritation more than fear, ready to complain to the camera company in the morning, and then I saw it. My daughter's yellow jacket hung neatly over the porch chair, dripping steadily onto the concrete. There was no wind strong enough to blow it there, no nearby hooks it could have fallen from, and absolutely no reason it should be sitting perfectly centered like someone had placed it with both hands. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared at it, feeling the kind of fear that doesn't make you jump, but instead makes your breathing slow and shallow. I finally approached it, lifting the sleeve with 2 fingers. It was soaked, but not with fresh rainwater. The coldness felt deeper, almost like the fabric had been lying in water for hours. The name tag I'd written at the start of the school year was half torn, as though someone had tried pulling it off. I checked the driveway, the sidewalk, even the storm drain, searching for any sign of who could have left it. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no drag marks from the chair, just the steady dripping from the jacket's hem. I carried it inside, locking the door behind me with a force that made the frame shudder. My hands were trembling, and I kept telling myself it had to be a harmless misunderstanding. Kids grab the wrong jackets all the time. Parents return them without thinking. That's all. When I woke my daughter to ask whether she had lent her jacket to someone, she blinked at me in confusion. "Dad, someone touched it," she whispered. I asked what she meant, thinking she was half asleep. She told me she felt someone tugging the jacket earlier that night, not at school, but at home, after she'd already changed into pajamas. She said she felt a hand pull the collar while she was brushing her teeth, and assumed it was me moving past her in the hallway. My stomach dropped. I had been in the kitchen at that time. I asked her if she saw anything. She shook her head. "It was cold, though," she said softly, "like the air outside." I swallowed hard and hugged her, telling her she probably dreamed it. I didn't believe my own words. I went straight back to the footage. The camera showed nothing between 9 and 11, except that same flicker, those same slow, lagging frames. But when I downloaded the file and ran it through the timeline manually, I found one frame, just one at 10:42 p.m., where the image warped sharply. A thin, elongated blur stretched from the railing to the door, like the camera had caught movement faster than it could process. It wasn't shaped like a person, but more like an arm reaching forward. The length of it made no sense. My eyes watered as I stared at it, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling that something had been inches away from my home while I sat inside pretending everything was fine. I didn't show the frame to my daughter. I didn't save it, either. The next morning, I took the jacket to the school office, thinking maybe someone could explain the torn tag or confirm whether another parent had picked it up by mistake. The secretary checked the attendance log, then checked the lost and found again, and finally looked at me with concern. No jackets had been turned in. No parents had contacted them. No teacher had seen anyone near the hooks after the event ended. Before leaving, I asked about the night custodian. Maybe he found it outside and dropped it off as a courtesy. She told me there was no night custodian scheduled. The school had been closed to staff after 7 because of electrical issues caused by the storm. I walked out feeling more frightened than reassured, gripping the wet fabric like it was evidence of something I didn't want to name. I decided to check the neighborhood cameras, going door to door and asking politely whether anyone else had footage from the night before. Most cameras were angled away from my house. A few showed only passing cars. One neighbor's camera pointed directly toward the street in front of my place, and when he pulled up the recording, we both leaned in. Nothing. No one walked near my driveway, no vehicles stopped. Even when the timestamp hit 10:42, the frame didn't change, just rain sliding down the lens, but mine had shown something at 10:42. Something reaching. I thanked him, forced a smile, and walked home with a sensation like needles pricking the back of my neck. I spent the afternoon going over every logical explanation I could think of, but each one unraveled. If someone returned the jacket, why avoid every camera? Why hang it so carefully? Why tear the name tag? And why did my daughter feel someone tugging it afterward? I ended up calling a technician to inspect the porch camera. He checked the wiring, the connection, the lens, everything. He said the equipment was fine, but he paused at one detail. The motion sensor had been triggered 12 times between 9 and 11. 12. Yet not one alert had reached my phone. The logs showed the triggers clearly, but the camera had recorded almost nothing. "It's like something moved too close or too fast," he murmured, then apologized for speculating. He left looking unsettled. By evening, I decided I needed to give my daughter closure. I sat with her and explained that whoever took the jacket probably wanted her name tag for some silly reason, maybe a classmate who liked the design. She nodded slowly, but kept fiddling with the frayed corner of the fabric. Then she whispered, "Dad, what if it wasn't a person?" I told her gently that everything is always a person, even when it feels strange. She let it go, but her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway where she'd felt that cold tug the night before. I told her she could sleep in my room, and she agreed immediately. That's when I realized she had been afraid long before I noticed anything. Later that night, I washed the jacket by hand. As I scrubbed the fabric, a tiny piece of the torn name tag came loose and drifted upward, lighter than the rest. It floated for a moment before sticking to the side of the sink. My handwriting was still visible on it, but the ink looked smudged in a way I couldn't explain. Not blurred by water, but stretched, as if someone had dragged a fingertip over it again and again while the fabric was still drying. I stared at that distorted ink for a long time before finally rinsing it away. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit something I had resisted from the moment the jacket reappeared. Whatever had touched it, whatever had returned it, whatever had stood on my porch at 10:42 p.m. had focused on my daughter's name, and it wasn't interested in anything else. A low, frantic buzzing from the front desk phone pulled me out of my chair, and I remember thinking it was probably another guest complaining about the generator flickering again. I picked up with the usual greeting, but before I could finish, the automatic doors slid open behind me. A man stepped in, calm, composed, rainwater dripping neatly from the shoulders of a dark jacket that looked more expensive than anything anyone usually wore into our small-town hotel. He didn't hurry or shake off the rain. He just walked straight toward me with the kind of steady confidence people have when they know exactly where they're supposed to be. I noticed his eyes first steady, alert, like he was trying to read everything about me before I even spoke. He said he needed a room for the night, voice low and polite, and for some reason I felt myself trying too hard to match his calmness. When I handed him the form to sign, he wrote slowly, almost deliberately, and slid it back without meeting my eyes. I gave him the keycard for room 204. He nodded once, thanked me, and walked toward the corridor. I remember tracking him until he disappeared around the corner because there was something about the way he moved, sure, unshaking, like nothing about the storm outside bothered him at all. After he went up, I tried to shake off the strange feeling and went back to the shift log. It must have been maybe 20 minutes later when I noticed the lobby security feed flashing on my monitor. Camera 2, pointing toward the second-floor hallway, showed him walking toward his room. He paused briefly at the door, almost like he was listening for something inside, then swiped the card and entered. The door closed slowly behind him. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, but the movement had a certain deliberate heaviness to it. I remember leaning back in my chair, telling myself I was overthinking it, that sometimes my imagination got the better of me when I worked these long, isolated night shifts. I made tea, tried to focus on paperwork, but every few minutes my eyes drifted to the screen where that hallway stayed perfectly still. I don't know why I kept expecting the door to open again, as if he'd forgotten something and would walk back out. But he never did. The hallway remained frozen in that eerie, quiet way hotels get once everyone settles into their rooms. Morning arrived with that thin gray light that always made the lobby feel colder than it should. I was getting ready to hand the desk over to Lente, the morning receptionist, when 2 police officers walked in. Their uniforms were wet, and one of them shook out his cap before asking if the manager was around. I told them I was the only one there for the moment and asked what was wrong. They exchanged a quick look, and the shorter officer pulled out a photo, a grainy ID-style picture of the same man who had checked in the night before. My stomach tightened instantly. They asked if I recognized him. I said he arrived around 10, signed in, and was in room 204. The taller officer exhaled sharply and told me something that felt so impossible, so thoroughly wrong, that I actually laughed before I caught myself. He said the man in the photo had died earlier that evening, not late at night, not an hour ago, but hours before he ever walked into my lobby. A car accident on a rural road outside Parle. Witnesses, confirmed fatality, body taken to the morgue. I kept waiting for the part where they'd correct themselves, say it was a misunderstanding or someone who just resembled him. Instead, the officer asked me to show them the registration form he allegedly signed. I walked them behind the desk with my hands shaking. The form was exactly where I left it. His name signed in slightly slanted handwriting, the same name printed on their photo. They studied it carefully before asking to see the room. I led the way upstairs, my heart pounding so loudly I worried they could hear it. When we reached 204, I knocked even though every instinct told me nobody would answer. The officers told me to unlock it. I did. The room was empty. The bed untouched, no suitcase, no clothes, no signs of occupancy, nothing. The guest folder I had left on the pillow the night before was still perfectly aligned, exactly the way housekeeping prepared it. One officer asked if I was sure he went in. I said yes, I watched the surveillance myself. They asked to see the footage. So we went back down to the lobby, and I replayed the recording while they watched in complete silence. There he was, walking into the hall, pausing at the room door, entering with the keycard I issued him, shutting the door behind him, everything visible, undeniable, right there on the screen. The shorter officer rubbed his face like he was trying to stay patient, and asked me again what time the man arrived. I said around 10. He told me the accident report listed the time of death at 7:28 in the evening. They asked for the key card, so I opened the drawer where I kept spare room keys and logged cards. Room 204's guest card was right where I placed it earlier that night. Clean, dry, unused. They told me to check the system. I inserted it into the reader. No check-in signature, no registered entry, no log of the door opening at all. The system showed the room had not been accessed since housekeeping left that afternoon. My throat tightened so badly I could barely speak. The officers exchanged glances again, not dismissive ones, but unsettled ones. They weren't treating me like someone lying, they looked like men who wanted a logical explanation just as badly as I did. One of them finally asked if the guest said anything unusual when he checked in. I told him no. He was calm, polite, normal. Except I hesitated, realizing I'd buried a detail. Until that moment his clothes hadn't seemed wet enough. I remembered thinking he should have been drenched considering how soaked he looked at first glance. But now that I replayed it in my mind, the water on him never dripped onto the counter, never pooled on the floor. It clung to him in a strange, fixed way, almost like it wasn't reacting to anything around it. I didn't say that part out loud. I just said he didn't seem in a hurry despite the storm. The officers left after taking statements, promising they'd contact the hotel if they needed more information. When they walked out, the lobby felt unnervingly quiet, like the walls had absorbed everything we talked about. I stayed behind for another hour to try and finish my shift notes, but every sound made me jump. I kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the guest floors, expecting to see him standing there. My hands were cold, stiff, almost numb, and no matter how much I tried to steady my breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the previous night had been deeply wrong. Not just unusual wrong. Later that afternoon, after trying and failing to sleep, I went back through the registration form. His handwriting caught my eye again. The loops, the slant, the slow, almost deliberate strokes. It looked controlled. Not sloppy, not rushed, not the handwriting of someone jittery or injured. But at the very bottom corner of the paper, something else caught my eye. A faint, almost invisible smear. Not ink, not dirt. It was dried mud, the same kind I'd seen once on the shoes of accident victims pulled from rural roads after heavy weather. My stomach twisted so violently I had to sit down. I checked the timestamp on the lobby camera footage again. 10:13 p.m. Exactly. The same timestamp he wrote on the form as his arrival time. What finally settled the whole thing for me came the next day, when housekeeping came downstairs, looking uneasy. They said they went into room 204 to prepare it for a new guest, and found something lying on the chair by the window, a single key. The old metal hotel key from before we switched to electronic cards years ago, one with the room number engraved by hand. They swore they had cleaned that room earlier, and it wasn't there. When they handed it to me, it felt cold, not room temperature cold, but cold like metal left outside overnight. I kept turning it over in my hand, trying to make sense of it. Our hotel hadn't used those keys since before I started working there. I reported it to the officers, but they didn't have answers either. They just reminded me the man in the photo had been identified by next of kin, his death confirmed, and the body buried after the post-mortem. No missing person confusion, no mistake. He was dead. He had been dead hours before he ever appeared at my desk. For weeks afterward, I avoided looking at the second-floor hallway camera. Even now, years later, I can still picture the exact moment he paused at the door of room 204, like he wasn't entering a space, but returning to it. And every time I lock up the lobby late at night, I catch myself glancing at those automatic doors, half expecting him to walk in again, calm and dripping gently, ready to sign his name one more time. Something felt off the moment I opened the taxi door, and I couldn't blame it on the rain or the cold or the late hour. It was the way the driver looked at me through the rearview mirror before I'd even sat down, like he already knew me. I pulled the door shut, wiped the water off my glasses, and gave him the address of my apartment in Marty. He repeated it slowly, almost testing the sound of it, and then he said, All right then, Matthias, let's get you home. My stomach dropped so suddenly, I tasted metal. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Not since I buried it legally, socially, personally. I'd spent so long building my life as Mira that the sound of Matthias wasn't just wrong. It felt violent, like someone peeling back my skin without permission. I leaned forward and told him calmly that my name wasn't that he must be confusing me with someone else. He didn't argue, he just gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if I'd confirmed something for him. I tried to brush it off. People make mistakes. Maybe he had the wrong passenger in mind. I checked my phone to look busy, to anchor myself to something normal, but my hand trembled. He kept glancing at me in the mirror, little flicks of his eyes that he probably thought I wouldn't catch. I put my phone down and asked if everything was all right. Instead of answering, he said, "You changed your hair. You didn't have the fringe before." I froze, because he wasn't guessing, he was remembering. I told him again that he had the wrong person, speaking sharper this time. He didn't react with annoyance or confusion. He reacted with something far worse. Certainty. "You're sure you didn't call me?" he asked. His tone was soft, genuine, almost worried. "Someone sounding like you did. Someone who said their name was Matthias and needed a ride. Said they'd be standing exactly where you were." I shook my head because the alternative that someone used my dead name, knew where I was, and knew I needed a taxi made my skin crawl. I asked him what number the caller used. He hesitated before admitting he hadn't checked because the dispatcher had simply forwarded the order. "And the voice?" I asked. "Did it sound like me?" "A little," he said. "Not the pitch, but the way they spoke. Like someone trying not to cry." I stared at the window, watching the water slide down the glass, trying to breathe normally. I had been waiting outside the grocery store for maybe 5 minutes. I hadn't called anyone. I hadn't posted my location, shared it, or messaged anyone. So how did someone imitate my voice and call a taxi to me? The driver kept talking quietly, almost to himself. "I've been doing this 20 years. When someone's scared, you can hear it, even if they don't say it. And that person, they were scared." I didn't want to ask, but I forced myself. "Scared of what?" He sighed through his nose. "They said someone was following them. Someone who knew too much." My chest tightened. "Did they describe the follower?" "No," he said. "They hung up before they finished. Thought maybe it was just a prank. I needed the ride to be over." Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but the streets were nearly empty, and the last thing I wanted was to stand alone in the dark, replaying the word Matthias in my mind. So I stayed in the back seat and watched the buildings blur past, every flicker of light catching like a pulse in the mirror. We were halfway home when his phone rang through the car speaker. The screen showed dispatch. He tapped to answer, and the operator's voice filled the car, crackly and stressed. "Miko, did you pick up your 2240? "Yes," he said, glancing at me again. There was a pause. "You actually picked them up?" "Yes, she's in the car now." "Why?" Another pause. Longer. He frowned at the windshield. "Hello?" The dispatcher's voice came back tight and low. That call was canceled. The passenger called back and said they didn't want the taxi anymore. They canceled 5 minutes before the pickup time. Said they were leaving the area. I felt my breath stutter. "What time exactly?" I asked, leaning forward. 22:35, the dispatcher said. "Why? Is something wrong?" I checked the lock screen on my phone. 22:35 was exactly the moment I stepped outside the store. I ended the call for him because he wasn't moving, and I didn't want to hear another word from the dispatcher. "Drive," I whispered. "Just drive." He obeyed without argument. The silence in the car grew heavy and deliberate. I kept replaying the timeline. Someone called a taxi for me before I arrived outside the store. Someone used my dead name. Someone corrected the order after I walked out, meaning they were close enough to see me. I asked the driver if he noticed anyone nearby when he picked me up. He shook his head but said the street was nearly empty. "But someone could have been parked," he added. "Or standing by the wall. Hard to see when everything's wet." I pressed my hand to my chest to keep my breathing steady. "Do you think someone was watching me?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. When we turned onto my street, something tightened inside me. My building was dark, except for a light in one stairwell window. There were no people, no cars, nothing unusual, until the driver slowed down and pointed. "Is that your entrance?" I nodded. He leaned forward. "Then who is that?" A figure stood beneath the awning, back toward us. Head slightly bowed, like they were reading something on their phone. The rain wasn't heavy enough to obscure the shape. They weren't tall, weren't broad, weren't dressed distinctively, and that made it worse. Anyone could be that shape. Anyone could wait like that. I told the driver to keep going, to circle the block. As we passed the entrance, the figure didn't look up, but something about the angle of their head made my stomach twist. I couldn't see their face, but I recognized the stillness. The same stillness I had when I waited too long outside, terrified of being seen. We turned the corner. I told the driver to stop. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to be dropped off anywhere someone could find me. The driver pulled into a parking spot and turned in his seat. "You're not safe going in alone," he said. "I can wait here. Or drive you to the station." I didn't want the police. Not yet. I just needed to think. I asked him if he could drive me to a friend's place instead. He nodded, started to type the address into the GPS, and then his phone buzzed again. It was a text, no name. Just a number. "Where are you going, Matthias?" My throat closed. I whispered, "Open it," even though every part of me wanted him to drop the phone. He tapped the message. A second text came in instantly. "You got in the wrong taxi." I grabbed the phone out of his hand. The number wasn't Finnish. I didn't recognize the country code. Before I could react, a third message arrived. "Turn around." Neither of us moved. I didn't breathe. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to confirm there was someone behind the car. But the driver slowly reached for his mirror and angled it. The awning outside my building was empty. The figure had vanished. But someone much closer, stood at the far end of the street in the glare of a street lamp, as though they'd been walking toward us and stopped when they saw the car had stopped. Their clothes were indistinct, wet, clinging. Their face was partly hidden by their hood. But even through the blurred glass, I saw their posture. Slightly forward, intent, focused directly on us. The driver didn't wait. He slammed the car into gear and pulled away so quickly the tires slipped. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the figure followed. He didn't speak again until we reached the main road, where there were other cars and other people. Where it finally felt like the world was normal again. I asked him why he helped me, why he believed me, why he didn't just tell me I was imagining things. He kept both hands on the wheel and said, "Because whoever called me used your voice. Crying, asking for help. And I've never heard a voice sound so close to breaking." I felt the weight of that settle in my chest. "Why would someone pretend to be me?" I asked. He looked at me in the mirror, not in a strange way, but in a steady, human way. "Maybe they needed you to get into the car," he said. "Maybe they needed you alone. Maybe they needed you afraid." I shivered. "But why cancel the ride?" He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding something back. "Maybe they wanted to see which taxi you'd get into. To know exactly where you were going." I didn't respond. I just watched the rain slide across the windows again and tried to swallow the cold rising in my throat. He stayed with me until I got into my friend's building, and I never used that taxi number again. I changed my routes. I changed my routines. And for a long time, every time someone said my real name, Mira, I felt grateful, almost relieved, like I'd escaped something that wanted to drag me backward. I never found out who used my dead name. I never found out how they mimicked my voice. But I know one thing with absolute clarity. They weren't trying to hurt the person I am. They were trying to resurrect the person I used to be and use him against me.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open.